finished a very interesting book by David McGowan called Program to Kill. You can read it for free if you want to online. Just type in Program to Kill PDF on Google. It should be the first result. And in this book, he goes over all of the most well-known serial killer cases, and a lot of them that are unknown. I mean, I didn't know probably half of the people that he covered in this book. And he gets really deep into a lot of the information that most of us are just not aware of, being the general public is just not aware of all the details behind these crimes and these criminals, especially the evidence presented in the court cases and all of those little details that you're never really going to read about in a newspaper article or even in a documentary that you might see. And it shows a lot of mainstream manipulation of these stories. And the book was just fascinating, and it's very well sourced. I mean, this guy is not just writing this book and presenting his own theories. He's not going off the rails with a lot of the stuff that he's presenting. It's very well sourced. And he asks a lot of interesting questions like why these stories were told in the way that they were to the public. And a lot of these serial killers are not the people that we are led to believe that they are. Most of them are very much criminals. They did a lot of really nasty stuff, but there's a bigger story here that David McGowan is trying to get to, and is really showing the reader that we are not being told the whole truth. In fact, we are given bits and pieces of the truth and being shoved in a completely different direction. So the book details a lot of these criminals and the fact that a lot of them were framed, or they were taking the rap for a group of killers. So this really goes deep into what we think serial killers are and what we've been led to believe serial killers are. I don't know if a lot of people really get into these TV shows like I mean, they seem to be really popular, the CSIs, but also they have the Criminal Minds. I've seen a few episodes of this. I thought it was pretty interesting stuff, and they go really deep into the psychology of a serial killer and what a serial killer is, why they do what they do. And after seeing these shows and some of these movies and stuff about serial killers, you really come away with the opinion that, okay, a serial killer is somebody that they were abused as a child and they have this compulsion to kill, and they are driven by their compulsion to kill, and that's what creates a serial killer, and that's why these people were arrested, and that's why they're guilty of their crimes. But when he goes through the evidence on these cases, man, does it paint a much different picture. So the picture that he paints for a lot of these cases is that these guys, a lot of them, were not serial killers in the sense that we think that they are after watching television and movies and these like Criminal Minds, where they have the FBI's Office of Behavioral Science, and they're always categorizing these guys as, you know, they're compulsive killers and they must do this. But when David McGowan goes to the evidence in his book, it's much different than that. A lot of these killers, they are guilty of murder, rape, I mean, a lot of different things, but a lot of the murders that are attributed to them are clearly not guilty of. So he goes through the evidence on these cases, and it really gets crazy. The book starts out with Marc Dutroux, the Belgian Beast. This guy was convicted in 1989 to 13 years for raping 5 girls, one of whom, or the youngest of whom, was 11. Okay, so he goes to prison, and in prison they do an psychological examination of him, and then they say, okay, you know, this guy's a perverse psychopath and he's a danger to society. That is on record for his, like, that's in his medical records when he went to prison. Okay? But instead of serving 13 years, he was let go after 3 years by Justice Minister Melchior Wathalet. I'm sure I'm murdering that guy's name. But, okay, so he gets let go out of prison after 3 years, and then the guy who lets him go quickly gets appointed to serve as a judge on the European Court of Justice at The Hague. Okay, so anybody with common sense can say, all right, well, they're letting this guy go because he's also been accused of running child prostitution, child pornography, human trafficking, all these things. And apparently, he's doing this for people in places of power, which is why he only served 3 years when he was convicted in '89. Shortly after Dutrox's release, young girls began to disappear in the vicinity of some of his homes. Though technically unemployed and drawing welfare from the state, he nevertheless owned at least 6 houses and lived quite lavishly. His rather lucrative income appears to have been derived from trading in child sex slaves, child prostitution, and child pornography. Many of his houses appeared to stand vacant, though at least some of them were in fact used as torture and imprisonment centers where kidnapped girls were taken and held in underground dungeons. Some of Dutrox's homes were used in this way for several years following his early release, with a growing body of evidence to indicate that fact to the police. Authorities nevertheless failed to act on the information or acted on it in ways that implied either complete incompetence or police complicity in the operation. Officials seem to have routinely ignored tips that later proved accurate, including a report from Dutrox's own mother that her son was holding girls prisoner in one of his houses. In addition, key facts were withheld from investigators working on the disappearances, and lines of communication were unaccountably broken, inexcusably hindering the investigation. Police did search one of Dutrox's homes on no less than 3 separate occasions over the course of the investigation. On at least 2 of those occasions, 2 of the missing girls were being held in heinous conditions, imprisoned in a custom-built dungeon in the basement. Nevertheless, according to The Guardian, the police searches came up empty, even though the investigating officers reported hearing children's voices on one occasion. It was not until August 13, 1996, 4 years after the disappearances began, that authorities arrested Dutrox along with his wife, who was an elementary school teacher. They also arrested a lodger, a policeman, and a man The Guardian described as an associate with political connections. Elsewhere identified as John Michael Niehull, a Brussels businessman and nightclub owner. One of those taken into custody, Michael Lillever, described in a May 2002 BBC report as a drug addict and petty thief, reportedly told his interrogators that at least some of the girls abducted by the ring were kidnapped to order for someone else. This is just one of the many statements by suspects and witnesses that were later be dismissed by Belgian officials. 2 days after the arrest, police again searched Dutrox's home and discovered the soundproof dungeon torture center, as CNN reported 3 years earlier. Police ignored tips from an informant who said Dutrox was building secret cellars to hold girls before selling them abroad. In addition, in 1995, the same informant had told police that Dutrox had offered an unidentified third man the equivalent of $3,000 to $5,000 to kidnap girls. Incredibly, it was later reported by The Guardian that police actually had in their possession a videotape of the dungeon being constructed. Belgian police could have saved the lives of 2 children who were allegedly murdered by the pedophile Marc Dutrox if they had watched a video seized from his home which showed him building their hidden cell. The tape had been seized in one of their earlier searches. At the time of the final search, 2 14-year-old girls were found imprisoned in the dungeon, chained and starving. They described to police how they had been used as child prostitutes in the production of child pornography videos. More than 300 such videos were taken into custody by police. On August 17, 1996, the story got grimmer. As police dug up the bodies of two 8-year-old girls at another of Dutrox's homes, it would later be learned that the girls had been kept in one of Dutrox's dungeons for 9 months after their abductions, during which time they were repeatedly tortured and sexually assaulted, all captured on videotape. The girls were then left to slowly starve to death. Alongside of their decimated corpses was the body of Bernard Weinstein, a former accomplice of Dutrox who had occupied one of the houses for several years. Weinstein had been buried alive. A few weeks later, 2 more girls were found buried under concrete at yet another of Dutrox's properties. Autopsy reports suggest they were drugged and then buried alive. By that time, 10 people connected to the case were reportedly in custody as the body count mounted. The outrage of the Belgian people grew. They demanded to know why this man, dubbed the Belgian Beast, had been released after having served such an absurdly short sentence. And they demanded to know why, as evidence had continued to mount and girls had continued to disappear, the police had chosen to do nothing. How many girls, they wanted to know, had been killed due to this inaction. Adding further fuel to the fire, as a Los Angeles Times report revealed, claims by a highly regarded children's activist, Mary France Bott, that the Justice Ministry is sitting on a politically sensitive list of customers of pedophile videotapes. The same report noted, the affair has become further clouded by the discovery of a motorcycle that reportedly matches the description of one used in the '91 assassination of prominent Belgian businessman and politician Andre Kool's. Michael Borlet, the head prosecutor on the pedophile case, meanwhile has publicly declared that the investigation can be thoroughly pursued only without political interference. Several years ago, Borlet was removed from the highly charged Kool's case, which remains unsolved. A report in Time magazine alluded to murky links between the Dutrox operation and organized crime figures. Mark Verwilgen, the chief investigating magistrate on the case, stated the case more bluntly. For me, the Dutrox affair is a question of organized crime. Also mentioned in the Time article was the use of secret underground tunnels, not unlike those described by children a decade earlier at the infamous McMartin preschool. Outrage continued to grow as more arrests were made and evidence of high-level government and police complicity continued to emerge. One of Dutrox's accomplices, businessman Jean-Michel Nihal, confessed to organizing an orgy at a Belgian chateau that had been attended by government officials, a former European commissioner, and a number of law enforcement officials. A Belgian senator noted quite accurately that such parties were a part of the system, which operates to this day and is used to blackmail the highly placed people who take part. According to the BBC, Nihal has brazenly claimed, "I am the monster of Belgium," and he has all but dared the state to prosecute him, claiming that he is beyond the reach of the law because he has information that, if made public, would bring down the government and the entire state. If in September '96, 23 suspects, at least 9 of whom were police officers, were detained and questioned about their possible complicity in the crimes and or negligence in investigating the case. As the Los Angeles Times noted in a very brief 2-sentence report, the detainments were the latest indication that the police in southern city of Charlotte may have helped cover up the alleged crimes of Marc Dutrox. The arrest followed raids on the police officers' homes and on the headquarters of the Charleroi police force, which were based on information supplied by Police Inspector George Zicker, who had already been charged as an accomplice. 3 magistrates had also reportedly been interrogated by police officers. Just days before the arrest, police had also arrested 5 suspects in the Kool's assassination, including a former regional government minister named Alan Vanderbeest. Strangely enough, the News Telegraph reported that police investigating the Kool's murder in '91 had been given helpful leads by some of those arrested in the Dutrox case. The Telegraph also noted that Kool's had promised shocking revelations before his death. On October 14, 1996, came the straw that broke the camel's back. Jean-Marc Corneret, who had been serving as the investigating judge on the Dutroux case, was dismissed by the Belgian Supreme Court. Connerotte was viewed by the people as something of a rarity, a public official law enforcement officer who actually appeared to be pursuing a prosecution rather than a cover-up. The News Telegraph described him as the only figure in the judiciary that enjoys the nation's confidence. As the New York Times reported, Connerotte became a national hero in August after saving 2 children from a secret dungeon kept by a convicted child rapist and ordering the inquiry that led to the discovery of the bodies of 4 girls kidnapped by a child pornography network. He had also arrested 3 men in '94 as suspects in the Cool's assassination, just before the case was transferred to the jurisdiction of another magistrate. A May 2002 BBC report revealed that after Connerotte's removal, a special team of police officers interviewing Regina Louf and other ex-witnesses, as they were called, were the next to be sacked. The ex-witnesses were victims of the pedophile ring who had come forward to tell harrowing tales of their victimization. A woman named Regina Louf was the first of 11 such victims to be interviewed by police officials. Louf claimed that she had been victimized by the ring, which included her parents and her grandmother. From the time that she was a very young child, she described the operation in detail to authorities, supplying them with names that included senior judges, one of the country's most powerful politicians now dead, and a very influential banker. According to Louf, the operation was big business for Blackmail. There was a lot of money involved. Many of her victimizers, she said, were secretly filmed for blackmail purposes. Louf identified Michael Nihal as a regular organizer of parties. These parties, she said, not only involved sex, they included sadism, torture, and murder. She described in detail the murdered victims and how they were killed. The BBC reported that when police checked into Louf's claims, they were able to verify key elements of Regina's story and found that at least one murder that she says she witnessed matched an unsolved murder. Nevertheless, the same BBC report revealed that today in Belgium, Regina Louf's reputation is destroyed. The prosecutor general of Liège, Anne Thilly, declares she's completely mad despite numerous statements from independent psychologists to the contrary. According to the judges now on the case, her testimony has been declared worthless and will not be presented in any trial of Dutroux or his associates. Connerotte's removal from the Dutroux case fanned the smoldering flames of public outrage, as the Times reported. Hundreds of thousands of people had petitioned the High Court to retain the judge. Adding yet more fuel to the fire, prosecutor Michael Borlet was claiming that evidence indicated a pedophile ring composed of wealthy and powerful people had been protected for 25 years. With the families of Dutroux's victims calling for a general strike, men and women all across the country walked away from their jobs in protest as railway workers and bus drivers shut down public transportation, bringing some cities to a virtual standstill. The Telegraph reported that in Liège, firemen turned their hoses on the city's court buildings to symbolize the massive cleanup that was in order. On October 20th, 1996, 350,000 citizens of tiny nation of Belgium took to the streets of Brussels dressed all in white, demanding the reform of a system so corrupt that they would protect the abusers, rapists, torturers, and killers of children. The political fallout from the case ultimately brought about the resignation of Belgium's state police chief, interior minister, and justice minister, who became sacrificial lambs tossed to the outraged masses to avoid what could easily have exploded into a full-scale insurrection by the people, particularly after police incompetence allowed Dutroux to escape and remain at large for a brief time in April 1998. As of May 2002, nearly 6 years after Dutroux was taken into custody, his trial had yet to begin. Parents of victims continued to loudly shout of a cover-up, and the Telegraph was reporting that it was recently learnt that scientific tests on 6,000 hairs found in the underground dungeon began only this year. Those tests, of course, could reveal how many victims passed through Dutroux's chamber of horrors. Perhaps more importantly, they could also, as a BBC News report noted, in January of 2002, establish whether the girls had any other visitors. Anne Thilly, the aforementioned prosecutor general of Liège, who dismissed as mad a key prosecution witness, has been quoted as saying, quote, There was no need to get the hairs analyzed as no one else entered the cage. There was no network, so there was no need to look for evidence of one. In any case, the hairs have all now been analyzed." End quote. Philly gave no indication of how she knew there was nothing to find before even bothering to look. And contrary to her claims, the BBC reported in May 2002 that the hairs had still not been analyzed, according to sources central to the investigation. Philly has also claimed that the bodies recovered from Diderot's properties were too decomposed to test for DNA. The BBC, though, noted the autopsy states quite clearly that the bodies were not decomposed. Samples were taken. It is just that no one seems to know what has happened to the results. The January BBC report came on the heels of an interview that the imprisoned Dutroux granted a Flemish journalist and a Belgian senator. Therein, Dutroux was quoted as admitting, quote, "A network with all kinds of criminal activities really does exist, but the authorities don't want to look into it," end quote. He also acknowledged the existence of a, quote, "a well-grounded pedophile ring. I maintained regular contact with people in this ring. However, the law does not want to investigate this lead," end quote. Another lead that was never seriously investigated involved allegations of a satanic cult involvement in the abductions. In '96, police found a note at Bernard Weinstein's home that led them to investigate the Abraxas organization and its high priestess Dominique Kindermans. Some segments of the Belgian press speculated that the organization was a satanic cult that assisted in obtaining young girls for ritual sacrifice. It seems quite obvious that this guy is part of a network that traffics in children, child pornography, child prostitution, Satanism, and all sorts of messed up stuff involving very powerful people. There is an interview, you could still find it on YouTube, of a girl that testifies about all of the activities. I don't think it was associated necessarily with Marc Dutroux in this specific case, but it details a lot of similar things that go on in these satanic cults and what she was a part of. You can find it on YouTube, and I'll put it on the screen if anybody wants to find that video and actually watch it. It's pretty really disturbing stuff.
Friends of family and strangers, and my family used to rape me, make me abort the babies I had.
It would be hard to imagine more misery and suffering than what Teresa says she's had to endure.
Then us kids would be made to do things with the adults and the animals, and then a sacrifice would happen.
The sacrifice, were these animal sacrifices?
Animals and people.
On what scale do you think this was happening?
Enormous, far beyond what we've ever heard of here before.
Teresa's mother, Bridget.
You're talking about mass murder?
Yes, on a scale that this country's never heard of before.
But one of the interesting things that David McGowan goes on in this book is he starts out with the Belgian beast, Marc Dutroux, which I was just reading about. He also goes over a lot of the serial killers here in the United States and the details that are not widely reported about their involvements with satanic cults or possible involvement with satanic cults, and he really lays out the information that is presented in the court cases and all of their just very strange accomplices and dealings and the evidence against them, which is just ridiculous when you actually scrutinize it. A lot of the serial killer convictions that he goes over just reek of a cover-up for something much larger. So let's go over John Wayne Gacy. His father was an alcoholic who beat his mother and shot his dog when he was younger. And as a teenager, John Wayne Gacy worked in Las Vegas both as a mortuary and as an ambulance attendant. At the mortuary, it is said that he had a habit of sleeping in the embalming room amongst the corpses. He was fired after some of those corpses were found to have been partially undressed. In the 1960s, John lived in Waterloo, Iowa, where he owned several businesses, including 4 restaurants, a clothing design firm, and a motel. During that period of his life, he joined the JCs and quickly forged a bond with a man who soon became the local chapter president. This particular JC chapter was known at the time to be involved in prostitution, pornography, and various other crimes of vice. A local prosecutor identified Gacy's motel, managed by his newfound friend, as the hub of those activities. According to the prosecutor, the motel was a front for a gay and straight prostitution ring. Gacy was in the habit of hiring many young people of both sexes to work at his business. He also reportedly set up what is described as a social club in his basement and recreation room, which he kept well stocked with drugs and alcohol to supply to his numerous underage guests. He was also said by those who knew him at the time to control his wife and to openly offer her sexual services to friends and colleagues. One former employee also said that Gacy always carried a gun. On March 11, 1968, Donald Voorhees Jr., son of a JC and former Iowa State Representative, gave a statement to police alleging that Gacy had assaulted and sodomized him. In early May, Gacy was indicted by a grand jury, though no further action was taken for several months. On September 12th, John made a court appearance at which he was ordered to submit to a psychiatric examination at the ominously named Psychopathic Hospital of the State University of Iowa. While in custody there, he spoke freely to investigators of wholesale corruption among the city's elite. He talked of gambling, prostitution, pornography, wife-swapping, and the corruption and complicity of the local police. He supplied the names of numerous JCs, police personnel, and various other prominent individuals who were involved in criminal enterprises. When brought before a judge, Gacy threw himself at the mercy of the court and entered a guilty plea. On December 3, 1968, he was sentenced to a 10-year term. He served less than 2 of those years, earning parole on June 18, 1970. While in prison, he somehow managed to always have money, cigars, and civilian shirts, all difficult commodities to attain for most prisoners. According to some reports, Gacy received electroshock and aversion therapy while incarcerated, allegedly to cure him of his homosexuality. Just 8 months after his release, he was again arrested, this time for disorderly conduct. Despite the violation just 8 months after that, he was released from parole. Another 8 months after that, on the summer solstice of 1972, he was again arrested and charged with aggravated battery and reckless conduct. Gacy had allegedly offered a young man a ride on June 7th, identified himself as a police officer, and then attempted to handcuff the boy. Failing in that endeavor, Gacy then clubbed him on the back of his neck, kicked him, and then pursued him with his car and struck him down. Curiously, the charges were dismissed against Gacy, whose fingerprint card on file with local police carried the alias Colonel Gacy. In July 1975, the first known victim whose death would be attributed to John Gacy disappeared. The young man, John Butkovich, was an employee of Gacy's construction company, which specialized in drugstore remodels. Gacy's home was later found to be fully stocked with an array of pharmaceuticals. Just one night before his disappearance, Butkovich had been involved in a disturbance at a friend's house. He was rumored to have gone to Puerto Rico to traffic drugs, and his family received a collect call from a woman in San Juan who claimed that John was alive and well. Someone apparently made an effort to thwart a missing persons investigation. Boys and young men continued to disappear for the next several years, though no one really paid much attention. The missing boys were routinely considered runaways by the police, despite pleas from many of the parents to investigate their sons' disappearances as missing persons cases. On January 6, 1978, Gacy was arrested for deviant sexual contact, but the assistant state's attorney rejected the filing of felony charges. 6 months later, Gacy was charged with battery. A 27-year-old man had been picked up and then knocked out with a rag placed over his mouth. He awoke in a park with burns on his face and a bleeding rectum. The man had been picked up from the city's gay district, where Gacy was very well known and widely believed to be a cop. The victim gave police the license number of Gacy's car, and he was soon taken into custody. Several court dates were allowed to pass with no action taken on the charges. John Wayne Gacy was, after all, a very well-connected guy. He served as a lighting commissioner and as a Democratic Party precinct captain. He was claimed to have been an aide to Chicago Mayor Richard Daley. He was known to be on friendly terms with Illinois Attorney General William Scott. He also claimed that local columnist Mike Royko and local TV anchorman Walter Jacobson were good friends of his. He once had his photo taken with First Lady Rosalind Carter. The image is signed, "To John Gacy, best wishes, Rosalind Carter." In the photo, Gacy is wearing a Secret Service S lapel pin, indicating that he had been given a high-level security clearance. Another hint of Gacy's political connections was provided by an observation made by one of his prosecutors. 2 items on Gacy's Chicago police report were blacked out, indicating that they were FBI matters. John also laid claim to having organized crime connections, which is not surprising given the fine line between politics and organized crime. Gacy claimed not only that he himself worked for the syndicate, but also that he was a cousin of local mob figure Tony Accardo. Gacy continued in Chicago his practice from Iowa of surrounding himself with the young people. He frequently entertained as a clown at hospitals, orphanages, and private parties. He also hired a steady stream of teenage boys to work for his construction firm, at least 3 of whom went missing. On the night of December 11th, 1978, a young man named Rob Peast disappeared. He had last been seen outside of the pharmacy where he had been then employed, talking to Gacy about a job with his construction company. The Peast family focused their suspicions on John Gacy and pharmacy owner Phil Torf, who was evasive when questioned about the boy's disappearance and refused to provide Gacy's address. For unexplained reasons, Torf had remained at the pharmacy that night with his friends until 1 a.m., 3 full hours after closing time. The Peast family quickly grew angry with the police after their handling of the case. They began threatening to storm Gacy's home. In order to pacify the family and prevent them from acting on their threats, police agreed to begin surveillance on John Gacy. Assigned the task was a special Delta unit of the Des Plaines Police. What followed was a surreal game of cat and mouse in which Gacy at times all but joined the surveillance team, whining and dining his alleged pursuers, inviting them into his home and allowing them to ride along with him in his car. At other times, he would drive manically around town with the Delta unit in pursuit, reportedly hitting speeds up to 100 miles an hour even in school zones. Amazingly, he was never stopped during such escapades, let alone ticketed or arrested. Police also searched Gacy's home, which was said to be meticulously neat. The search yielded a number of interesting items: a high school ring that belonged to one of the missing boys, an Illinois driver's license issued to another boy, marijuana and rolling papers, a vast supply of pharmaceuticals, a switchblade knife, a pair of handcuffs, police badges, a hypodermic syringe, numerous items of clothing that were obviously too small for Gacy, a photo lab receipt later traced to Rob Peast, an empty brown bottle that had contained chloroform, a blood-stained rug, and a homemade stock. One room in the home was completely filled with clown pictures. The crawl space underneath the house, where employees had been asked to dig trenches, was covered with a layer of lime, useful for hastening the decomposition of bodies. There were nearly 30 of them buried there in shallow graves. More had been dumped into the Des Plaines River some 60 miles from Gacy's home. Police opted not to arrest Gacy at the time of the search, despite the seemingly incriminating evidence found in his home, and despite the fact that they had received complaints from at least 5 assault victims, 3 in Chicago alone, all alleging druggings and torture administered by Gacy, and despite the fact that Gacy still had charges pending against him from the incident earlier in the year. However, Gacy did have an alibi for the evening that checked out. He had been at the hospital at the site of his uncle, who died the very night that Rob Peast disappeared. On the eve of the winter solstice, Gacy was arrested for the final time, although not on murder charges but for possession of marijuana. Just the day before his arrest, the conviction of Elmer Wayne Henley in Texas had been reversed. Henley had been convicted a few years earlier in 1974 for his participation in one of Gacy's chroniclers described as a homosexual torture ring that killed 27 boys. Henley and his two accomplices provided quite a model for Gacy to follow. The trio lured young boys to the home of Dean Corll, where they were tortured, raped, and killed on a special torture board in Corll's plastic-draped bedroom. Their bodies were then buried beneath a layer of lime in Corll's rented boathouse, while the parents of several of the victims received phone calls or were sent letters assured them that their sons were still very much alive. In Houston, as in Chicago, police insisted on classifying the growing numbers of missing boys as runaways. Gacy's marijuana arrest prompted a second search of his home, during which the bodies in his crawl space were discovered. How they were not discovered during the earlier search or detected during the numerous visits to Gacy's home by his surveillance team remains a bit of a mystery. Every corner of his house was said to literally reek of death due to the decomposition of bodies buried in the shallow graveyard just beneath the floorboards. The second search also turned up a garage freezer that contained unmarked frozen meat and a container full of what inspectors suspected was blood. These items were later claimed to be nothing more than stewed tomatoes and non-human meat, although one would think seasoned homicide investigators would know the difference between stewed tomatoes and blood. While his home was being searched, Gacy was taken to Holy Family Hospital for a medical examination allegedly due to complaints of chest pains. Immediately upon his release from the hospital, John read and signed a Miranda waiver and began confessing to the murders. One of his first questions to police was, quote, "Who else do you have in the station? There are others involved," end quote. Gacy was then asked if the others were involved directly or indirectly, to which he responded, quote, "Directly, they participated," end quote. Asked who these others might be, he answered simply, "My associates." He was also asked where Rob Peast was, to which he answered, quote, "I don't know, I didn't transport him," end quote. When asked who did, he replied, quote, "I can't say," end quote. This interrogation was cut short by Sergeant Long and then later resumed with two attorneys at Gacy's side. No further mention was made of any accomplices, and the issue does not appear to have been pursued thereafter. Perhaps notably, though, the homicide rate in Chicago area soared following Gacy's arrest, possibly indicating that a large cleanup operation ensued, and on December 28th, a week after John's arrest, a fresh body was fished from the Des Plaines River. Although Gacy confessed to being a mass murderer, he had very little knowledge of the crimes to which he confessed. He claimed, for instance, that all of the victims were strangled, but forensics evidence suggested that at least 13 of them had in fact been suffocated. He provided a map of the locations of the bodies under his house that press reports claimed were accurate, even though it actually contained numerous discrepancies. Gacy was able to recall sketchy details of only 5 of the killings. Of the other 28, he had no memory at all. He claimed that the murders began in 1974, but then later stated that the first occurred in January 1972. He attributed all of the murders to an alternate personality that he referred to as Jack Hanley. John was denied bail and sent to Cermak Hospital, which was the medical wing of the local jail and kept isolated from other inmates. Jail personnel were instructed to have no contact with him either. Not long into his stay, Gacy wrote a letter that read, quote, "Since the dark shadow of Satan has come over me, it seems that my fair weather friends have run away," end quote. During his second week at Cermak, he consented to an interview, with the full cooperation of his attorney, during which he once again confessed to the murders. He claimed rather preposterously that the victims were mostly male prostitutes who he had killed over price disputes. To explain how he had gained control of the young, healthy victims prior to killing them, Gacy put forth a dubious story about using a handcuff trick to get the young men to handcuff themselves. On January 10, 1979, not guilty pleas were entered on Gacy's behalf in response to the 7 murder counts that had been brought against him. On April 23rd, a grand jury handed down indictments on 26 additional counts, bringing the total to 33. 2 days later, Gacy entered not guilty pleas to the additional counts. Jury selection for his trial began in January 1980, despite intense pretrial publicity, overshadowed for a time by news of the carnage at Jonestown. The venue of the trial was not changed. Instead, jurors were selected from another county and then sequestered. Remarkably, the jury selection process was over in just 4 days. The trial began in February 6, 1980. Following opening statements, the state called 60 witnesses to present its case against John Gacy. The defense's case, such as it was presented in less than a week. Gacy was clearly unhappy with the work of his legal team. In a letter to the judge, he complained, "I asked that my trial be stopped, and I haven't heard from you. When I asked my attorney as to why we are not putting on any more witnesses, I am told that we don't have money to bring in experts." The state began its rebuttal of the defense case on February 29th, and due to the numerous doors opened by mistakes made during the abbreviated presentation of a defense, it was given enormous latitude. Prosecutors allowed to call, for instance, a number of witnesses who had survived attacks by Gacy. Their testimony had originally been excluded. These young men all told similar stories of druggings and torture that were highly damaging to the defense. It must be said here that these victims all told of being victimized solely by Gacy, which seemed to indicate that he was indeed the sole perpetrator of the crimes committed against the 33 dead victims. What was never explained, however, was why it was that after these victims had been subdued, raped, and tortured, and were completely under the control of the alleged serial killer, that they were subsequently released, very much alive and able to bear witness against the defendant. Serial killers, we are told, are essentially slaves to their unnatural desires who, once they up the ante and begun killing their victims, are unable to stop themselves from killing again and again. And yet we are led to believe that John Wayne Gacy, purportedly one of the most successful and most deranged serial killers of all time, was able to torture his victims for hours on end, but then pull back from the edge and opt to let some of them go now and then. And we are to believe that he had no concern with leaving living witnesses that could easily have been disposed of in his crawl space. The possibility exists that Gacy was not actually able to kill alone, although he was clearly capable of raping and torturing his helpless victims. Perhaps, as his initial statements to police indicated, there were others involved in the actual killings, and Gacy's house was just a convenient place to dispose of the bodies. Gacy himself suggested such a scenario in another of his letters to the judge, quote, "As you know, other than the so-called statements made by me and given in a self-serving manner by officers for the prosecution, there is only evidence that I owned the house that was used for bodies and their safekeeping." End quote. Gacy's statement was an accurate one, as outrageous as it may at first appear to be, and there were at least half a dozen people known to have keys to Gacy's home. One of the surviving victims who testified against Gacy had a rather interesting story to tell. Under oath, he told of having a meeting with the police, the assistant state's attorney, not long after his initial complaint was filed. At that meeting, he was not allowed to sign any complaints against Gacy and was bluntly informed that no action was going to be taken. The last rebuttal witness called was a man named James Hanley, whose purpose was reportedly to discredit Gacy's claim of having an alter personality named Jack Hanley. The state claimed that Gacy had appropriated this man's name for his concocted altered personality in an attempt to avoid responsibility for his crimes. Prosecution claimed that the witnesses' belated appearance was due to the fact that they had had investigators looking for Hanley for more than a year, but somehow the police computer didn't turn up his name. That was a rather stunning claim, given that Hanley was one of their own. He had been a plainclothes detective with the Chicago Police Department since the late 1960s. To no one's surprise, a Gacy's jury reached a verdict on their first vote after less than 2 hours of deliberations. He was found guilty on all 33 first-degree murder counts following just 2 more hours of deliberations. After the sentencing phase of the trial, the jury unanimously voted to impose the death sentence. While awaiting his scheduled execution, Gacy occupied his time painting portraits of clowns and Disney figures, a common pastime of convicted serial killers, many of whom consider themselves to be artists, including painters, poets, writers, and musicians. While it is abundantly clear that Gacy was involved in the abductions and murders, it seems unlikely that he was acting alone. In addition to the facts already presented here that indicate the possible involvement of others, there were other indications that something was not quite right about the Gacy case, and that elements of the police were complicit in the operations. Following the disappearance of one of Gacy's employees, Greg Godzik, John was not questioned by police for a full 3 months. Godzik's frustrated parents turned to help to a private investigator, Anthony Pellicano Jr., a shadowy character who tends to surface in organized crime and Hollywood circles. Pellicano never checked out Gacy and later claimed that he had never been given the name by Godzik's parents, which was an interesting claim given that the primary reason for his hiring was to investigate the man that the police refused to investigate. Pellicano nevertheless maintained that he had been told that Greg worked at a gas station, not for John Gacy. Godzik was reported seen still very much alive after the time of his reported abduction, as was at least one other victim and former Gacy employee John Sizek. In one of those bizarre coincidences that seem to surround serial killer cases, the Godzik home was burglarized the night before the story of John Wayne Gacy's arrest hit the airwaves. The family of victim Rick Johnston was convinced that Rick had been abducted by the Reverend Sung Myung Moon's Unification Church, an organization heavily steeped in mind control and with extensive connections to South Korean's version of the CIA. Victim John Moe, a former Marine, was the second sibling in his family to fall prey to a sadistic killer. His sister Judith had been found stabbed to death in her apartment in November 1972. As for the unnamed others who were possibly involved in the killings, there were any number of people who lived for varying periods of time in the Gacy home or who regularly spent time there, all of whom denied knowledge of the crimes and of the source of the stench permeating in the house. One of Gacy's longtime employees and sometimes house guest, identified only by the pseudonym Dick Walsh, was said to be evasive when questioned. He was given a polygraph examination, but his examiners claimed they were unable to render a definite opinion. There is no indication that further examinations were attempted. Another Gacy employee was Gordon Nebel, who reportedly worked as the company's bookkeeper. He was curiously misidentified in the logs that Gacy's surveillance team kept of his visitors, even though the officers were well aware of Nebel's identity and aware that he worked 2 days a week inside the death house. 2 other associates of Gacy's, Donald Merrill and Ronald Rode, were known to have protected and shielded John from police during his period of surveillance. Neither of them appears to have been investigated in connection to the crimes, nor were any of the numerous names that appeared in Gacy's address book marked with the mysterious H. Whether any of these associates were involved in the deaths of the victims will likely never be known. The man in the best position to provide answers to those types of questions was executed by the state of Illinois on May 10th, 1994. It definitely seems to me that John Wayne Gacy was part of a ring or group of people who were abducting these victims and killing them for various reasons, whether it was for satanic purposes, sacrificing them, doing, who knows, with organized crime. There's a lot of different reasons why you would do this kind of sick, sadistic stuff with these people, but it definitely opens up your eyes when you start reading the details of these cases. All right, now let's cover Ted Bundy, probably one of the most well-known serial killers, and they're making there's a Netflix series, I think, starring Zac Efron that they're putting out on Ted Bundy. So There's a lot to be said about him in this book. So, Theodore Robert Bundy was yet another serial killer whose parentage remains obscured. He entered this world in 1946 at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, and he was promptly abandoned there for 3 months by his mother, Eleanor Cowell. He was raised to believe that his mother's father, Sam Cowell, was his father as well, which he may in fact have been. Chronicler Anne Rule has written that the identity of Ted's real father was unknown outside of the family, and that he was a shadowy man whose real identity grows more blurred with every year that passes. Throughout his life, Bundy described his church deacon father/grandfather in glowing terms, while other family members have characterized him as a horrendously violent and abusive man who terrorized his family and was sadistic to animals. Sam Cowell's own brothers reportedly stated on numerous occasions that somebody should kill him to spare others further misery. In October 1950, Ted's mother began calling herself Lois and legally changed her son's name from Theodore Robert Cowell to Theodore Robert Nelson for no discernible reason. The next year, she married Johnny Culpeper Bundy and changed Ted's name once again. Johnny, a former Navy man and a member of a large clan of Tacoma Bundys, was employed at, of all places, a military hospital at a joint Army-Air Force complex. Ted attended Woodrow Wilson High School in Tacoma, Washington. At least according to his former classmates, he did. That cannot be verified, however, since all records of Bundy's enrollment there have strangely disappeared. After graduation, he worked for a municipal electric utility. In the spring of 1967, Ted met a woman identified by the pseudonym Stephanie Brooks. She was the daughter of a wealthy California family and was just one of the many women who would be drawn into Ted's orbit. In the summer of 1968, Bundy received a scholarship to attend Dr. Lund's Stanford University. Just as that tiny geographic region of the country was about to become the serial killer capital of the world. Ted purportedly attended Stanford for sessions in intensive Chinese studies, although nothing else in his biography hints at any interest in Chinese studies. That same year, Ted traveled to Florida to attend the Republican National Convention as a supporter of presidential candidate Nelson Rockefeller. At about that same time, he worked as a driver and bodyguard for Art Fletcher, a candidate for a lieutenant governor in the state of Washington. In 1969, Bundy traveled to Aspen, Colorado for an extended stay after telling friends that he had been hired as a ski instructor, which turned out to be a lie. The real reason for Ted's stay in Aspen remains unknown. He also paid a visit to Arkansas that year, reportedly to visit relatives. In September of 1969, another woman entered Ted Bundy's orbit, variously identified as Liz Kendall or Meg Anders. She was the daughter of a prominent doctor in the Mormon stronghold of Ogden, Utah. Despite her social standing, her estranged husband was a convicted felon. Meg/Liz apparently did not have the best taste in men. In 1971, Ted began working at the Seattle Crisis Clinic as a paid work/study student. He remained there through May 1972. His work partner in the clinic was none other than Anne Rule, a policewoman cum true crime reporter whose brother had been recently killed, allegedly by his own hand, at, where else? Stanford University. Ted left the crisis center to intern at Harborview County Hospital as a psychiatric counselor. His salary there was funded by a federal grant. He also worked that year as a key organizer for Washington Governor Dan Evans' re-election campaign. His job was specifically to spy and gather intelligence on the governor's opponent. Governor Evans later personally wrote Ted a glowing letter of recommendation to a Utah law school. Ted next worked for a variety of city, state, and county law enforcement entities. In April 1973, he became a special assistant to Washington's Republican Party chairman, Ross Davis, whom Ted frequently dined with and whose children, amazingly enough, he occasionally babysat. In July of that same year, Bundy again flew to the San Francisco area just as the dust was settling from the flurry of ritual murders that had terrorized that city. Just after his return to Washington, women began disappearing from the Seattle-Tacoma area. Before that time, the Seattle area had experienced very few murders, but that was about to change dramatically. The body of the first victim attributed to Bundy was found on December 6, 1973. Catherine Mary Devon had last been seen 2 weeks earlier getting into a pickup truck after running away from home. The man from whom she willingly accepted the ride was not Ted Bundy. Her body was found to be missing its heart, lungs, and liver, purportedly attributable to scavenging animals. If so, those scavengers were very selective. Next to disappear was Linda Healy in the early morning hours of February 1st, 1974. According to the official version of events, Linda was abducted from the home that she shared with others. Bundy allegedly entered the house undetected by any of the home's other occupants, crept noiselessly downstairs, overpowered and killed Linda without waking a roommate sleeping just on the other side of a thin plywood partition, and without leaving behind any signs of a struggle, wrapped Linda's body, carried it back upstairs undetected, and then returned, still unnoticed, to make Linda's bed, hang up her nightgown, and grab a change of clothes for her. Nothing unusual about any of that. Later that same day, Linda's roommates received 3 phone calls from someone who made only breathing noises before hanging up. One of those very same roommates later roomed with one of Ted Bundy's cousins, a cousin with whom Ted had been very close since the age of 4. The brother of that same cousin with whom Bundy was also quite close was a teacher of what were described as disturbed youngsters. Linda herself did volunteer work at the Camelot House, described as an experimental school for retarded youth. The only remains of Healy ever found was her skull, based on which investigators speculated that she had been bludgeoned to death. According to Healy's mother, the positive identification of that skull was based on a single tooth, raising the question of whether Linda was actually ever found at all. There was certainly nothing ever found of college student Donna Gale Manson, the next girl to disappear. She was last seen on March 12th, but it took nearly a week before anyone bothered to report her missing. Whereas Healy, who bore no physical resemblance to Manson, was abducted from her home, Donna had reportedly been out walking when she disappeared. Donna Manson is said by Bundy chronicler Stephen McCloud to have dabbled in occultism, and Rule described her as having an obsession with death, magic, and alchemy. Found in her room was literature from Thought Power Inc., described by Rule as an organization offering seminars on positive thinking and mind discipline. The chief of the college police force, Alfred Pickles, reportedly ordered a perfunctory search of the campus following Donna's disappearance and then inexplicably delegated oversight of the case to, bizarrely enough, his secretary. One of Ted's friends had been Manson's occasional racquetball partner. Another friend of Ted's was a jogging partner of Susan Rancourt, last seen April 17th. Only her skull was ever found, along with several others on nearby Taylor Mountain. Along with the proliferation of missing girls, the Pacific Northwest was grappling with another emerging problem in the spring of 1974, an abundance of what are referred to as cattle mutilations. While conspiracy theories attempting to explain this phenomenon abound, such theories frequently involving UFOs and alien experimentation, many police investigators and independent researchers have linked these occurrences to local satanic cult activity. Next to disappear from Seattle area were Roberta Kathleen Parks and Brenda Ball. Both were later identified only by skulls that were found on Taylor Mountain. Ball was not reported missing for 2.5 weeks following her purported abduction. She was, curiously enough, an acquaintance of Bundy chronicler Ann Rule's daughter. Georgian Hawkins reportedly disappeared from a well-lit, heavily traveled alleyway running along her campus's Greek Row on July 11, 1974. Many of her fellow students were up late that warm night, and virtually every window along Row facing the alley was open. Georgianne was seen by fellow students approaching her sorority house right up until she was within a few seconds of the entrance. Nevertheless, she then disappeared without anyone seeing or hearing a thing. No clues were left behind and no body was ever found. Police investigators, including a man named Herb Swindler, who took over as head of the homicide division on the very day that Georgianne's disappearance was reported and who had been friends with Ann Rule for 20 years, were at a loss to explain the disappearance. A high school friend of Ted Bundy's was a friend of the missing girl's family. On July 3, 1974, a law enforcement summit was held in Olympia, Washington that was attended by 100 representatives from Washington and Oregon. A prime topic of conversation at the summit was the wave of missing girls, which was rather odd since only one of the girls' remains had yet been discovered, confirming that she had met with foul play, and there was no indication whatsoever that the disappearances, which occurred over a wide geographic area, were connected in any way. In attendance at the summit were Army's Criminal Investigations Division and Bundy, friend and chronicler Ann Rule. Each of the 7 girls that had disappeared thus far, Devine, Healy, Manson, Rancourt, Parks, Ball, and Hawkins, had vanished without a single clue having been left behind. There was no witness and no forensics evidence to tie anyone to any of these crime scenes. In some of the cases, it could not even be determined when or where the crime had occurred. All of that was about to change. On July 14th, just days after the crime conference concluded, Janice Ott and Dennis Nesland, both reported disappeared from a very crowded Lake Samish park in broad daylight and in front of literally thousands of potential witnesses, including a sizable chunk of the Seattle police force who were holding their annual picnic there that day. Ott, a probation officer whose father had sat on the Washington State Board of Prison Terms and Paroles, was the first of the 2 to disappear that day, apparently sometime around noon. No one ever saw her leave or get into a car with anyone, and it was never explained what happened to her bike, which disappeared along with her and which would not have fit into Bundy's Volkswagen. Nasland, a known drug user who was said to usually have a supply of downers on hand, but who nevertheless babysat for a good friend of Ann Rule, disappeared around 4:30 p.m. One witness saw a girl matching her description ride off from the park with a biker gang. She reportedly yelled, "No, I can't. Let me off." Many years later, Nasland's mother wrote a brief note that was displayed at her daughter's memorial service, which read, "God forgive them for what they have done. I love you." It has never been explained why she used that peculiar wording. A total of 8 witnesses came forward claiming to have seen the elusive predator in the park that day. One of them had seen Janice Ott in the company of a man with sandy blonde hair around the time of her disappearance. The descriptions offered by the other witnesses varied. Only 2 of them were able to identify Bundy as the man they had seen, and then only after his image had been widely aired by the media, tainting the IDs. One thing that several of them agreed on was that the man had introduced himself as Ted. Why the stealthy killer would choose to show his face before thousands of potential witnesses, and why he would do so using his real name, are questions that have never been answered. Why Ted Bundy does not appear in any of the hundreds of photographs that were shot at the park that day is another question that has never been answered. Following the Lake Sam disappearances, the task force tracking the Seattle killer was dubbed the Ted Squad. One of the very first Teds reported to the newly christened task force was none other than Theodore Robert Bundy. His name was turned in by his friend Ann Rule, fresh from her attendance at the law enforcement summit. Ted would later also be reported by his fiancée, one of his college professors, and a former co-worker at one of the government agencies where he had worked. It was later determined that both girls had been strangled or bludgeoned to death, though that was a largely speculative conclusion. Only the girls' skulls and a few assorted bones were ever found on September 7th. These remains were examined by, curiously enough, Dr. Darris Swindler. The Rules book pointedly claims that Darris was no relation to Herb Swindler, although it is acknowledged that Dr. Darris Swindler is, in fact, a distant relative of Herb Swindler. One key piece of evidence to emerge from the Lake Sam disappearances was a possible name for the suspect. He had identified himself to several witnesses as Ted. Why the stealthy predator who had successfully abducted numerous women without leaving behind a single witness or forensics clue would suddenly operate in broad daylight using his real name was never explained. The task force became thereafter known as the Ted Squad. Among the very first Teds to be reported to the squad was Theodore Robert Bundy by his purported friend Ann Rule. Over the course of the investigation, 4 others would also report Bundy as well. His fiancée, the pseudonymous Liz Kendall, a college professor, and a colleague at the Department of Emergency Services. The fact that only the skulls of the girls were ever found further fueled the belief that some of the killings were cult-related. Rulesbook refers derisively to totally unsubstantiated rumors that the missing and murdered girls had been sacrificed and their headless bodies dumped, waded into the almost bottomless waters of Lake Washington. Chronicler McLeod, however, offered a different take. Occultism or Satan worship are creeds that local police say have long found a small but ardent following of practitioners around Seattle. He added that many people were convinced that a virulent offshoot of the Charles Manson family had moved to the Seattle area and had begun a new reign of terror led by Ted. Some on the Seattle police force were convinced that there was a cult involvement in the murders. A hefty file on occult activities in the area had been assembled, cryptically referred to as File 1004. The occult theories, though, were ridiculed by county police and prosecutors. The skulls that were recovered from Taylor Mountain were examined, curiously enough, by a local forensics expert named Darius Swindler, who Ann Rule claimed was no relation to Herb Swindler. Her friend and head of the homicide squad, McCod, however, acknowledged that Darius and Herb were distant relatives. After the Lake Sam disappearances provided the task force with a name, no further disappearances in the area were linked to Ted Bundy. That is not to say that no more girls vanished from the area, but rather that Bundy was no longer living there. He had moved to Utah to attend law school at the University of Utah, where he worked surprisingly enough as a campus security guard. The first Utah victim credited to Ted was Nancy Wilcox. Last seen on October 2nd, 1974, she was never seen again, alive or dead. Melissa Smith was the next to vanish on October 18th. Her intact nude body was found strangled and bludgeoned. The body had been almost entirely drained of blood and revealed a rather curious fact. Melissa had not been killed immediately, but had been kept alive for up to a week after her disappearance. Strangely, though, her makeup was undisturbed, none of her nails were broken, and there were no signs of ligatures. If she was held against her will prior to her murder, there was absolutely no indication of that fact. If it was Ted Bundy who had held her for the duration of that time, then he most certainly had accomplices. Just the day after the girl's disappearance, Bundy left on a hunting trip with his fiancée's father. The slain girl was, perhaps, significantly and perhaps not, the daughter of police chief of Midvale, Utah. Melissa's disappearance was followed by that of Laura Aim, who vanished on Halloween night 1974. Aim was also reportedly held for up to a week before her murder, and yet the hair on her strangled and bludgeoned corpse had been freshly shampooed just before or just after her death. Forensic tests revealed that she had been drunk at the time of her death. The local sheriff, Mac Hawley, was sold on another suspect as Laura's killer, a man who was later convicted of the brutal sex slaying of his girlfriend. Hawley once exasperatedly told a Ted Squad member, "Bundy had nothing to do with our case, so forget him. That man didn't do our case. I wish you'd get that through your head." There were indications that Laura had some awareness that her life was in danger. Her mother reported that the girl had said to her a few weeks before her death out of the blue, quote, "Mother, at my funeral, I don't want to be buried in a dress," end quote. The night of November 8, 1974, was purportedly a very busy one for Ted Bundy. He first allegedly attempted to abduct a girl by the name of Carol DeRanch from a shopping mall in Murray, Utah. Failing in that endeavor, he next struck to Bountiful, abducting Deborah Kent from outside the building where a school play was in progress. Kent's body was never found. The problem with this official version of events is that it would have been physically impossible for Ted Bundy or anyone else to have committed both of these crimes. First of all, the descriptions given by witnesses at the two crime scenes differ considerably. DeRanch described her attacker as having slicked back hair with a strong scent of alcohol on his breath. Reappearing at the school, the suspect was described as having long, brown, wavy hair and said to be handsome and well-dressed. and with no hint of alcohol in his breath. It is possible, of course, that Ted could have changed clothes, washed and restyled his hair, and rid himself of the alcohol smell sometime between the commissions of the two crimes. He would have had to do so, however, while driving a Volkswagen at over 100 miles per hour over rain-soaked streets, since the two crime scenes were 26 miles apart and only 15 minutes elapsed between his departure from the DeRanch abduction site and his first sighting at the school. These times were recorded in police logs, so it is well known to the members of the Ted Squad that it would have been impossible for Bundy to essentially be in two places at once. Nevertheless, they pretended as though both crimes were the work of the elusive Ted, even after a drama teacher at the second crime scene positively identified a drug dealer who was the initial suspect in the Kent case. On December 12, 1974, another law enforcement summit was held, the Intermountain Crime Conference in Nevada. Exactly 1 month later, Ted allegedly struck again, this time moving his operations to the state of Colorado, where, on January 12th, Karen Campbell disappeared from a well-lit, heavily traveled corridor at the Wildwood Inn. She had been seen just steps away from her room, where she reportedly was heading back to pick up a magazine. No one at the inn saw or heard a thing. There was no sign that there had been a struggle. Karen had reportedly argued with her fiancé on the day of her disappearance. Her badly bludgeoned body was later recovered. The next two alleged victims, Julie Cunningham and Denise Oliverson, who disappeared in March and April of 1975, were never found. After that, the disappearances strangely stopped, although it was another 7 months before Ted Bundy was arrested. In the interim, Ted received a Mormon baptismal. The circumstances of Ted's arrest were, to say the least, rather bizarre. He was stopped by Sergeant Barb Hayward of the Utah Highway Patrol, who just happened to be the brother of Captain Pete Hayward, the chief homicide detective for Salt Lake City County Sheriff's Deputy's Office. The only crime Ted appears to have committed on the night of his arrest, by Bob Hayward's own account, was driving down a street that happened to take him by the officer's house. Nevertheless, Hayward felt compelled to call in backup for the stop, and he was soon joined by 2 additional UHP troopers and a Salt Lake County detective. Why this manpower was required to stop a motorist who had not even committed a traffic violation remains a mystery. A thorough search of Bundy's car was conducted, which was illegal without the consent of the owner, since the officers, by their own admission, didn't have probable cause to suspect Ted of committing any crime. The officers claimed that the search was consensual, but Bundy maintained otherwise, and Ted would have been a fool to consent to the search, which no one connected to the case has ever accused him of being. Discovered in the trunk of Ted's vehicle were several provocative, though not illegal items, including a pry bar, a ski mask, a stocking mask, an ice pick, and a pair of handcuffs. That last item was said to connect Ted to the attempted abduction of Carol DeRanch, which involved the use of handcuffs. The cuffs that were found in Ted's car, however, were from a different manufacturer than the pair recovered from DeRanch's wrist. At the very time that Ted was being taken into custody, yet another law enforcement summit was underway, convened in Aspen, Colorado. The meeting was attended by detectives and prosecutors from California, Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. This conference was held behind closed doors, and all attendees reportedly took a fraternal vow of secrecy. On November 20th, a week after the summit began, Ted was freed after posting a bond. Following his release, he was purportedly thoroughly cleaning his VW, going so far as to take a garden hose to the inside of the vehicle. He also made some necessary repairs and then sold the car to a former classmate of victim Melissa Smith. Investigators later claimed that hair from 3 different victims managed to survive Ted's cleanup efforts. Bundy also moved out of his rooming house, which was under police surveillance. Oddly, though, the room he vacated was never searched for evidence. Utah authorities had no real evidence linking Ted to any of his alleged crimes in that state, but they nevertheless proceeded to charge him with the attempted abduction of Carol DeRanch. The victim was unable to identify Bundy from an initial photo lineup, saying, quote, "I don't see anyone in here that resembles him," unquote. Investigator Jerry Thompson, after presenting the photos to DeRanche, wrote in his notes, quote, "She really just doesn't know," unquote. She had no problem, however, later picking Bundy out of a lineup. Ted was prevented in a 7-man lineup alongside of 6 police detectives who were all a little older and a little heavier than Ted. Police detectives had, for unexplained reasons, rather hastily replaced the inmates who had originally been slated for the lineup. Not only did DeRanche pick Ted out of the lineup, but so too did 2 witnesses from the school where Debbie Kent had disappeared. Since it was, as previously noted, not possible for Ted to have been at both crime scenes, this lineup clearly had serious problems. It was alleged by some that Captain Hayward, the brother of the UHP officer who arrested Ted, heavily influenced DeRanche's identification. With Ted set to go to trial in the DeRanche case, a trial that would hinge almost entirely on the victim's rather shaky eyewitness testimony, Bundy's lawyer concocted a most remarkable strategy. At the last minute, he suggested waiving a jury trial and letting the presiding judge, Stuart Hansen Jr., decide the fate of the defendant. What Bundy's advocate, John O'Connell, didn't tell Ted was that all the principal officers of the court, O'Connell, Judge Hansen, and the prosecutor, Dave McGowan, had been buddies since their days together as classmates at the University of Utah. Ted Bundy was about to be railroaded, and it would not be for the last time. During the course of the trial, Judge Hansen regularly took it upon himself to question witnesses, which is roughly akin to a juror interjecting questions whenever he saw fit. The star witness for the prosecution, Carol DeRanche, delivered testimony that was riddled with discrepancies and inconsistencies. She was unable to decide if her would-be abductor had had a mustache or not. She told the court that his car had been white or tan, although she had initially told police that it was blue. She acknowledged on the stand that she had positively identified Bundy's car, even though by the time she did so, the car had been altered and no longer looked as it would have on the night of the incident. Many veteran court watchers found her to be somewhat less than credible, as would have, it stands to reason, many jurors. But there were no jurors, and Judge Hansen saw no problem with DeRanche's testimony. He pronounced Bundy guilty as charged on March 4th, 1976. Sentencing was initially set for March 22nd, but was then delayed so that Ted could be psychologically evaluated by Dr. Al Carlusel. While Bundy awaited his sentencing, his visitation privileges were severely restricted. Interestingly enough, though, Anne Rule had no problem at all being granted a special visit with Ted. Even though she was not a relative, she was not on the list of approved visitors, and she showed up on a day that was not a regular visiting day. Any one of those factors alone should have disqualified her from visiting Bundy. Nevertheless, she was not only allowed to visit with the prisoner who was being held nearly incommunicado, but she was allowed to do so without even being searched before being allowed in. On June 30th, 1976, Judge Hansen sentenced Bundy to a 1 to 15-year prison term, leaving open the possibility that he could be paroled in as little as 18 months. Ted's legal troubles were just beginning, however. On October 22nd, a warrant was issued for his arrest by the state of Colorado for the murder of Karen Campbell. The state's case against Bundy was virtually non-existent, consisting of a hair reportedly found in his car, gas purchase receipts that placed him in the state of Colorado at the time of Campbell's disappearance, along with millions of other people. Also in October, Utah's notorious Gary Gilmore, immortalized in a disinformational Norman Mailer book and made-for-TV movie, was convicted and sentenced to death. Gilmore immediately and improbably began campaigning to become the first man executed in the United States since 1962. He succeeded, earning himself an appearance before a Utah firing squad on January 19, 1977, and opening the doors to the resumption of state executions. Just over a week later, Bundy was taken to Aspen to stand before Judge George Lohr and answer to the charges filed against him in the Campbell case. It would not be the last time that a high-profile execution immediately preceded an important court appearance by Ted Bundy. Around the time that Bundy was awaiting trial in Colorado, a new woman entered his orbit, Carol Ann Boone, who had previously worked at a Vietnamese resettlement camp. She would later marry Ted and bear him a child. The judge and the prosecutor assigned to the Campbell case both reeked of corruption. Laura had just presided over the Claudine Longuet trial, which he had wrapped up by sentencing Longuet to an absurdly lax 30-day jail term for shooting and killing famed skier Spider Savage. District Attorney Frank Tucker had seriously compromised the prosecution by losing Longuet's diary, reportedly crucial to the state's case, after opting to take it home. Tucker would later be convicted not long after handling the Bundy case of 2 counts of embezzlement, 1 count of felony theft, and 2 misdemeanor counts. He was given a 90-day delayed sentence, a $1,000 fine, and was disbarred, prompting him to change careers and enroll in a mortician school in, where else? San Francisco. Bundy, perhaps catching a whiff of the stench wafting in the air over Aspen, resolved that he would defend himself. As the preliminary trial began early April, the state's case began almost immediately to self-destruct. On April 4th, the alleged eyewitness took the stand and confidently identified the man that she had seen, the Pitkin County undersheriff. Then the purported prison informant was quietly dropped, leaving the state without either of its witnesses. What was left were some gas receipts that proved only that Ted was in the state of Colorado, a tourist brochure that proved that only Ted may have thought about making a ski trip to Colorado, and a single hair that an FBI analyst claimed was microscopically indistinguishable from Karen Campbell's hair and that police claimed was recovered from Ted's car. The chances of gaining a conviction on that evidence in anything approaching a fair trial lay somewhere between slim and none. As it happened, there never was a trial. In a rather bizarre turn of events, Bundy opted not to stick around long enough to face trial. During a break in the preliminary proceedings, he purportedly escaped, after being conveniently left unguarded by jumping out an open window and strolling down the street. Ted then quickly and improbably found his way to an empty cabin that happened to be stocked with food, clothing, a rifle, a flashlight, batteries, blankets, and first aid supplies. He allegedly entered the cabin by prying loose the wire mesh that had been applied to the windows for security, though a caretaker later said that it would have taken superhuman strength to do so with bare hands, as Ted claimed to have done. Bundy did not remain free for long. He became lost and disoriented, causing him to fail in his quest to get away from the Aspen area and virtually guaranteeing his recapture. Once back in custody, Ted was assigned new counsel, jet-setting attorney Stephen Buzzy Ware. Ware was a flamboyant, larger-than-life character who regularly piloted himself around the country to handle major racketeering and narcotics cases. A few weeks after being assigned to the Bundy case, Ware was in a coma. He reportedly crashed into a rock wall in another one of those freak motorcycle accidents. His wife was killed in the crash. Forced to again represent himself, Bundy filed for a much-needed change of venue in order to get the case out of Aspen. The motion was granted, but that was hardly a victory for Ted. The new venue was to be Colorado Springs. Statistically speaking, there was no worse place in the state of Colorado for an accused murderer to stand trial. With his trial set to begin January 9, 1978, Ted again managed to escape from his captors. This time he allegedly climbed through a 12-inch square hole in the ceiling of his cell, which he had cut with a hacksaw, raising questions of where he obtained the saw and how he was able to noisily hack through the steel plate without anyone noticing. Once in the crawl space above his cell, he reportedly scurried over to the space above a deputy's empty apartment, lowered himself down into a closet, and then casually strode out the door to freedom. A prison snitch is said to have repeatedly reported hearing Ted's moving about in the crawl space at night, but nothing was ever done. It seems very odd, however, that a jail would ever be constructed in such a way as to create a crawl space. Once free, Bundy this time quickly located an MG Midget, which happened to be outfitted with a set of studded radial tires, a necessity for snow-covered roads he would be facing, and also happened to have keys already in the ignition. This time, Ted wasted no time getting out of town. By the time his disappearance was discovered at noon the next day, he reportedly was already in Chicago. His commandeered vehicle did not get him that far. It apparently broke down on the way to Vail. Luckily, though, he was picked up by a helpful GI who gave him a ride. He then traveled by bus from Vail to Denver, and then by plane from Denver to Chicago. Once there, he stole a car and drove it to Atlanta. From there, he made his way to Tallahassee, Florida, acquiring a new identity along the way, Chris Hagen. This is how the official story reads anyway. On January 15, 1978, a slaughter took place at the Chi Omega sorority house on the campus of University of Florida at Tallahassee. This crime did not even bear the slightest resemblance to any of the previous crimes attributed to Ted Bundy, but rather was reminiscent of the attack 12 years earlier that had been attributed to Richard Speck. 4 girls brutally bludgeoned in the early morning hours. 2 of them died from their injuries. A 5th girl was subsequently attacked at another location not far away. The first attack at the Chi O house purportedly occurred just after 3 a.m. and was over in just 15 minutes. In that brief period of time, a single assailant was allegedly able to go room to room, locating and viciously beating 4 women, in addition to raping and sodomizing 2 of them. One of the sorority sisters, Nita Neary, caught a brief glimpse of an intruder in the house as the man was leaving through the front door. She saw him only in a profile and described him as wearing a watch cap pulled down low over his face. His most noticeable feature, she said, was a large nose. Neary had just arrived home at 3 a.m. from a campus kegger party and was quite likely intoxicated to some degree, although the state claimed that its star witness had been quite sober on the night of the attack. Under hypnosis, she later said that the intruder closely resembled the sorority's houseboy who looked nothing like Ted. Another sorority sister, Carol Johnson, was only asleep that night for a total of 5 minutes, from 3:14 a.m. to 3:19 a.m. When she was awakened by Neary and others, nevertheless, she did not see or hear anything out of the ordinary that night. The first officers were on the scene by 3:23 a.m., just minutes after the dazed and bloodied victims staggered out of their rooms. These officers were quickly joined by a virtual army of city police, campus police, and county sheriff's deputies. The streets surrounding the house were soon brimming with squad cars, detectives, vehicles, ambulances, and a hearse. Nearly 40 distraught sorority sisters were milling about the house, many of them with blood dripping from their hands from their efforts to assist the victims. Joining the circus was an unspecified number of curiosity seekers who were allowed to roam freely about the house. Needless to say, the crime scene was hopelessly compromised before any serious investigation could even begin. Key evidence was destroyed at the scene, and the evidence that was preserved tended to point away from Ted Bundy as the likely perpetrator. For example, semen found in the bed of Cheryl Thomas, the 5th victim, proved to be from a non-secretor, effectively ruling out Bundy as the donor. Chewing gum that was discovered in the hair of one of the victims, and that could have yielded both saliva and bite mark evidence, was destroyed. Saliva that would have likely been present around an alleged bite wound in the buttocks of another victim was swabbed away at the scene. The wound was allegedly photographed at the scene, but the photos that were later produced were not taken with the medical examiner's camera. That camera purportedly malfunctioned, so the photos were taken instead with a standard 35mm camera, allegedly supplied by a crime scene specialist. The section of the skin that contained the incriminating marks was excised and placed in saline solution. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in the process. A sheriff's deputy on the scene prematurely ordered one victim's body, Margaret Bowman's, taken to the morgue before crime scene technicians had even ascertained whether any evidence was present on the corpse. And so it went at the Chi Omega house that fateful night. One rather curious fact about the crime scene that doesn't appear to have been commented on by any of Bundy's numerous chroniclers was observed by Ray Cruz, one of the first officers on the scene. Cruz later testified in court, and later repeated in interviews that the body of victim Lisa Levi was cool to the touch upon discovery. According to official version of events, however, she had been dead for just minutes before her discovery, not long enough for her body to have noticeably cooled. One other rather curious fact that proves once again that bizarre coincidences appear frequently in the stories of America's serial killers was that Darius Swindler, the forensics expert from Seattle, just happened to be in Tallahassee on the night of the killings. Another largely forgotten fact indicated that there was at least a possibility that the victims had not been randomly targeted. A set of keys to Thomas's house that likely were used by her killer were discovered in her backyard. Not long after the bloody rampage in Tallahassee, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach disappeared from Lake City Junior High School in broad daylight amid heavy rush hour traffic. Her body was found 2 months later, completely drained of blood. The cause of death was listed as homicidal violence to the neck region. The day after her disappearance, coincidentally or otherwise, Ted Bundy's name was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. There was no indication at that time that Ted had anything to do with the Florida crimes. They certainly didn't match his supposed M.O. There was no reason to suspect that Bundy was anywhere near the state of Florida. Ted was arrested shortly thereafter, bearing yet another new name, Kenneth Misner. His last night of freedom was spent, oddly enough, in a wooded area of the Eglin Air Force Base, a restricted military facility. He had in his car at the time an array of credit and identification cards, as well as several photos of girls and young women. After allegedly sending word that he wanted to talk without counsel, Ted was interrogated in Pensacola without an attorney present, and the conversation was taped. His public defenders later loudly complained that they had been refused entry to the interrogation room. The resultant tapes were filled with gaps, allegedly due to the tape recorder unerringly malfunctioning whenever Ted purportedly made incriminating statements. None of these supposedly confessional statements were recorded, but detectives swore that Ted had in fact made them. There were some interesting bits of conversation that were recorded, including this exchange. Police interrogator, quote, "Where did you get the money that you used after you escaped to travel across the country from?" Ted, "Well, man, there's other people. Other people are in on it." End quote. The next day, Bundy was handcuffed and brought to the courtroom under heavy guard, with his attorneys still complaining that they had not yet been allowed to see their client in jail. Following his appearance, Ted was taken away with what chronicler Richard Larson described as a strange, aloof look in his eyes. Bundy walked right past Larson, who was a friend of his, without any hint of recognition. The nighttime interrogations of Bundy continued for a week, first in Pensacola and then in Tallahassee. In the first week of March, Ted was brought to appear before Judge John Rudd, and on April 27th, Rudd issued a warrant authorizing Bundy's captors to take dental impressions of their prisoner, by force if necessary. Curiously, prosecutors had waited for over 2 months before taking steps to obtain this allegedly key piece of evidence. In July, a grand jury was convened to hear secret testimony pertaining to the disappearance of Kimberly Leach. On the 21st, an indictment was handed down, which a judge immediately ordered sealed. The next week, another grand jury was convened to hear evidence on the Chi Omega case. In December 1978, Judge Rudd was ordered by the Florida Supreme Court to disqualify himself from hearing the case due to his having shown an obvious bias against the defendant. Rudd was replaced by Judge Edward Cohart, a former Navy man and police officer. On May 31st, 1979, Ted was scheduled to appear before Cohart to accept the terms of a plea agreement that would have handily disposed of both the cases in which indictments had been handed down. In exchange for entering 3 guilty pleas to the 3 counts of first-degree murder, Ted was to receive 3 consecutive 25-year prison sentences. This would have been a great deal for Bundy if he was in fact guilty of the crimes he was charged with, and if the state had a solid case against him to prove that fact. However, there is scant evidence to suggest that that was the case. To ensure that Bundy stuck to the script and entered the guilty pleas, the state of Florida executed John Spenkelink just 6 days before Ted's scheduled court appearance. The message sent to Bundy could not have been any clearer. Take the deal or you too will have an appointment with Florida's old Sparky. To further drive that point home, Ted was brought to appear in the very same courtroom where Spenkelink had been condemned to die, with many of the same actors in attendance. For a time, Bundy was even represented by Spenklink's attorney, Brian Hayes. Spenkelink was curiously enough only the second man executed in this country since 1962. The first being, of course, the aforementioned Gary Gilmore. Before his electrocution, Spenkelink was asked if he had any final statement, to which he replied, "I can't talk. The chin strap is too tight." That was the only statement he was allowed to make. Ted was not intimidated. He refused the deal. On June 25, 1979, the Chi Omega trial began in Miami, Florida. It was the very first trial in U.S. history to be nationally televised. By June 30th, final jury selections had already been made. Sitting on that jury, according to at least 2 of Bundy's chroniclers, was a man named Vernon Swindler. For those who may have lost count, that brings to 3 the number of people named Swindler who played a part in the investigation and prosecution of Ted Bundy. Herb Swindler, the head of the homicide division; Darius Swindler, the forensics expert who examined the alleged victim's remains; and Vernon Swindler, the juror. Nothing unusual about that, I suppose, nor in the fact that Ted's defense team included a jury expert who was actually an Atlanta hypnotist named Emil Spillman. The case presented by the state was, to put it politely, problematic. A stocking mask was produced that was purportedly found at the Thomas residence and which was said to be identical to the one found in Ted's car during the illegal Utah search. Though one has to wonder how different one stocking mask could be from another. The mask from the Florida crime scene was said to have yielded 2 hairs from the head of Ted Bundy. Interestingly, though, the only eyewitness that night, Nina Neary, testified that the man she saw was not wearing any such mask. Of the 260 different fingerprints found in the Chi Omega house by detectives, not one of them matched those of Ted Bundy, even though Neary also said that the intruder she saw was not wearing any gloves. In court, Nina Neary positively identified Bundy, as she reportedly had done from a photo lineup, though she had wavered in that identification when she had first seen Ted in person, and as previously noted, she had said under hypnosis that the intruder more closely resembled the sorority's houseboy. She had also said that he had a very prominent nose, a feature that Ted was clearly lacking. The notorious bite mark evidence was presented to the jury, even though the actual bite wound had been destroyed and the photos purportedly taken of the wound had been shot with a camera other than that of the medical examiner, hopelessly compromising the evidence chain. The bite wound evidence was presented by a man named Dr. Richard Silveira, who had published his supposed findings before the trial even began, thereby contaminating the jury pool. In explaining the techniques he had used to come to his conclusions, the doctor may well have inadvertently revealed exactly where the photos of the victim's bite wound came from. "I took models from the castings of Bundy's teeth, and I went to the morgue and I pressed the models into the buttocks area on different individuals and photographed them. The good doctor took the castings of Bundy's teeth and used them to bite the buttocks of the corpses, and then photographed those bite wounds with a 35mm camera, but those were, of course, different 35mm bite wound photos than the ones that were allegedly taken of the actual bite wound victim. Although those photos were also taken with a 35mm camera rather than with the ME's camera, it couldn't actually be proven that there ever was an actual bite wound victim, since the purported evidence, physical evidence of the wound itself, had been destroyed." Bob Campbell, a Fort Lauderdale police officer who followed the trial, was skeptical of both the bite mark testimony and Neary's dubious identification of Bundy, despite the fact that he had a vested interest in seeing Bundy convicted, given that it was his sister that Ted had been on trial for killing prior to his escape in Colorado. Dr. Wayne DeVore was skeptical as well. Even if we take a leap of faith and assume that the photos of the bite wounds were legitimate, DeVore's testified that the tooth pattern visible in the photos was a very common one. The material of skin is flexible, elastic, and not at all good medium for which to compare bite marks. Bundy himself cast further doubt on the evidence when he attempted to introduce photographs demonstrating that one of his teeth had been chipped after the attack at the Chi Omega house. To prove that point, Ted requested a delay in the trial to subpoena all the negatives of photographs taken of him by the media. If Bundy's bite pattern had in fact changed after his arrest, then proving that would have conclusively proven that the bite wound evidence had been fabricated using castings of Ted's teeth. The judge disallowed the motion and no photographic evidence was ever reviewed by the court. This was certainly not the only ruling to go against Bundy. It was clear from the time of the opening defense statement that the court was heavily biased in favor of the prosecution. The defense's statement, which ordinarily would not be expected to draw objections, ran for just 26 minutes and was interrupted with an astounding 29 objections, 23 of which were sustained. When all was said and done, the jury deliberated for just 6 hours before finding Bundy guilty on all counts. Following the penalty phase of trial, the jurors required just an additional hour and 40 minutes to deliver 2 death sentences. Ted was sent to Death Row's Q Wing, otherwise known as the Bug Wing, where he took up residence in John Spinkeling's recently abandoned cell. In January 1980, he was back in court again to face murder charges, this time for the death of Kimberly Leach. This was virtually no chance of him receiving a fair trial. His name recognition in Orange County, where he was being tried, was said to be at 98%. Only the comatose were unaware of the notorious Ted Bundy. The state used that fact to their advantage, brazenly stacking the jury with those who had prior knowledge of the case. As Ted accurately noted, the state's case is predicated on knowledge outside this courtroom. Even Ann Rule acknowledged that the prospective jurors appearing willing to say almost anything so that they might be chosen. Ted's defense counsel this time around was a man named Vic Africano, who candidly described Bundy as a split personality. Court watchers noticed that Bundy seemed to have undergone a radical transformation from his previous trial, during which he had represented himself quite lucidly and animatedly. He now seemed distant, aloof, out of touch with his surroundings. It would later be revealed that Carol Boone kept him supplied with a steady flow of drugs and alcohol throughout the latter proceedings. There were ostensibly 3 eyewitnesses to the Leach abduction, but there were serious questions about all of them. The first was a 23-year-old crossing guard who remembered the day of the abduction as having been a warm, summery day, when in fact it had been a rain-drenched morning on which the temperature had been near freezing. According to the chronicler McCaud, during a deposition, this witness had told the attorney that he knew he'd picked up the right man because an FBI agent winked at him when he picked the right picture in the photo lineup. His testimony was deemed inadmissible, as was that of the second eyewitness, who had been unable to identify Ted for nearly 2 years before suddenly developing the ability to do so. The third eyewitness, C.L. Andy Anderson, had waited for weeks before belatedly reporting his version of the abduction to police. Anderson happened to work at the local fire station, which was conveniently enough located in the same building as the Lake City Police Department. Anderson's version of the incident was seriously lacking in credibility. He claimed that Bundy, ever the careful criminal, had improbably left his van parked in the street, blocking the only westbound traffic lane, during the morning rush, and while he leisurely prowled about the school looking for a suitable victim. In order to enhance his memory of that day, Anderson had reportedly been hypnotized. Another witness, a sporting goods dealer, claimed in court that he had sold Bundy a knife shortly before the crime was committed, but there was no evidence that a knife had been used in the commission of the crime, and the witness had initially identified another man in the photo lineup. The most compelling evidence of the state's case, on the surface anyway, was the purported fiber evidence. Fibers from a van that Ted had allegedly stolen and used for a period of 10 days were reportedly recovered from Leach's purse, bra, jersey, and socks. Conversely, fibers from her denim purse and jeans were said to be found in the van. The problem was that there was no evidence to suggest that Ted had ever stolen, used, or been anywhere near that van. None of Ted's or Leach's hair was ever found in the van, even though 100 hair samples were recovered from the vehicle, clearly demonstrating that no effort had been made to cleanse the van of the evidence. Similarly, dozens of latent fingerprints were found in the van, but none of them belonged to Ted. Obviously, no effort had been made to wipe the van down, which was not consistent with Bundy's other alleged actions. For instance, it was claimed that Ted's Florida apartment had been so thoroughly cleaned before his departure that not a single fingerprint could be found anywhere. Another problem with the fiber evidence is the notion that a fiber from a pair of denim jeans, a mass produce commodity, can be matched to a particular pair of jeans. There's absolutely nothing unique about any particular pair of blue jeans that would allow an analyst to ascertain that it was the garment that yielded an individual fiber, to the exclusion of all other pairs of jeans. These are not, in other words, fingerprints we are talking about here. These are textiles that are produced in enormous lots. The same is largely true of carpet fibers, including those from the van, which are also a mass-produced commodity. The best that can be ascertained is that a fiber came from a particular make of automobile, not from any specific vehicle. Claims to the contrary fly in the face of any sort of logic. The best that the state could do to connect Bundy to the van was through the testimony of detectives James Parmenter of Jacksonville. Prior to the Leach abduction, his kids had purportedly had an encounter with the van and its driver. Parmenter later arranged for his kids to be hypnotized, out of which allegedly came a positive ID of Bundy as the driver. Bundy was thus ever so tenuously linked to the van through the manipulated testimony of 2 young children of a police detective, and not through any physical evidence whatsoever, and the van was then tenuously linked to Kimberly Leach, though only through dubious fiber evidence. None of this really mattered, however, as Bundy's guilt was a foregone conclusion for the people of the state of Florida. It took the jury only 45 minutes to deliver yet another death sentence on February 9th. The second anniversary of Leach's disappearance, a fact that surely was not lost on the jurors, followed the verdict. Ted was sent to occupy a cell right next to that of our old friend Otis Toole. Throughout the 80s, long after Ted Bundy had moved on, women continued to vanish in and around the Seattle area, as many as 100 of them by some counts. In the summer of 1985, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program was launched at the FBI's headquarters in Quantico, Virginia. Ted Bundy was said to be the prototype on which the system was based. This system, despite the lofty goals implied by the name, has little to do with the apprehension of violent criminals and everything to do with the wholesale erosion of civil rights in this country, using the fear of a manufactured phenomenon, serial killers, to sell repressive measures to the American people. One of the biggest promoters of this system, who did nothing but go door to door to assist the FBI in its efforts to justify its implementation, was Ann Rule. The very same Ann Rule consented to be a witness for the prosecution during Bundy's so-called competency trials, which were an effort on Ted's part to persuade the courts to set his sentences aside and grant him new trials in Florida cases. In her book, The Stranger Beside Me, Rule, a former Chi Omega sorority sister, justifies the selling out of her purported friend by saying there would be a very real threat that Ted could work his way back through all of his legal thickets. In other words, if Bundy's verdicts had been set aside and if new trials had been ordered, there would have been a very real possibility that his previous trials would have been revealed as complete shams. The truth of the matter was, as Stephen McCod wrote, quote, "In the dozens of cases from Seattle to Florida in which the police have sought to implicate Bundy, there has not been a single bit of physical evidence that incontrovertibly demonstrates his involvement in anything more sinister than car theft." End quote. Mossad attributes this to Bundy being some sort of a criminal mastermind, a genius who was smart enough to always cover his tracks. In truth, there was never any evidence to suggest that Bundy was a genius. He was no doubt an intelligent man, but there is nothing in his academic records or in his IQ test scores to indicate that he rose to the level of a genius. In April 1987, the Associated Press reported that the incarcerated Bundy had been corresponding with attempted presidential assassin John Hinckley Jr., who was in turn corresponding with Manson disciple cum attempted presidential assassin Lynette Squeaky Fromm. Birds of a feather. On August 1st, 1987, Lamasse, on the occult calendar, Judge Cowart died of a massive heart attack while lying in a private hospital room that he had checked into for observation. He had no prior history of illness. Ted Bundy, calmed by tranquilizers, was put to death by the state of Florida on January 24th, 1989. In his final hours, he allegedly confessed on tape to an array of murders, including some in the state of Idaho, that he had never been accused of. Many of the details given in these confessions were either wrong or unverifiable, and the tape is difficult to hear, due purportedly to yet another tape recorder malfunction. One type of evidence that would have proven tremendously damaging to Bundy had it been introduced at any of his trials was Polaroid photographs of the murders. According to some officials, such photos did exist, taken by Ted himself. As with so many other cases, though, such evidence was never produced. Why? Perhaps because those photographs show actors other than or in addition to Theodore Robert Bundy. As you can see, there is so much more than meets the eye when it comes to these famous serial killer cases. And it definitely seems that it's like the lone crazy gunman thing, you know, whenever there's an assassination. It's just a crazy guy. He acted alone and he's dead or in jail or whatever. And we don't need to ask anymore. We don't need to scrutinize the situation anymore. It's like the same thing with serial killers. Hey, you know, all of these people died, and it was this guy's fault, and they're dead or they're in prison, and, you know, that's the end of it. We don't need to look any closer. We don't need to look at the details of the case, like what's outlined in this book, or any of the surrounding details of these serial killers. And it's pretty crazy the amount of corruption that is going on here with the manipulation of these cases and the amount of involvement that goes on with the people in society, like the politicians, the judges, the judiciary, the police officers, and all the other just weird stuff that's happening around these cases. So let's examine Jeffrey Dahmer's case. He was born in 1960, the son of a research chemist with PPG Industries. His father, Lionel Dahmer, is a PhD. He admitted that as a boy he had been fascinated with fire and the art of bomb making. He recalled that at 13 he wanted to hypnotize a girl so that he could control her entirely. Lionel Dahmer also said that Jeffrey had been molested at the age of 8, purportedly by a neighborhood boy by the age of 10. Jeff was experimenting with dead animals and learning to use acid to dispose of bodies. In 1975, 3 neighborhood kids found a mutilated dog in the woods behind the Dahmer home, its decapitated, gutted carcass hanging from a tree. A cross of sticks was nearby. 3 years later, while on a senior class trip to Washington, D.C., Jeffrey Dahmer made a call from a payphone and then announced to his high school classmates that he had secured them an appointment to visit the office of the Vice President of the United States. Though his friends naturally were skeptical, Jeffrey did indeed lead them on a tour of Walter Mondale's office, followed by a visit to the office of prominent writer Ark Buchwald. It has never been explained how the aspiring serial killer had established such impressive contacts in Washington, and it has never been revealed who it was that Dahmer called that day to arrange the impromptu private tours. A girl who dated Jeffrey briefly during their senior year recalled one date during which a seance was conducted at the Dahmer home. Someone in the group had suggested that it might be a good idea to try to contact Satan. The girl made a hasty exit from the house. Just after Jeffrey's graduation in 1978, his parents filed for divorce, both of them accusing the other of extreme cruelty. Jeffrey later claimed that he killed for the first time that summer, but no evidence was ever produced to support that claim. The identity of the purported victim was determined by having Dahmer choose from a collection of photographs of boys who had been reported missing around that time. Jeffrey enrolled at Ohio State University but attended for just 1 quarter before being taken to a military recruiter by his father. He began his military career on January 12, 1979. Dahmer sought training as a military policeman but was instead trained as a medic. He completed his training on the summer solstice and was then assigned to a West German military hospital. Dahmer was processed out of the service at Fort Jackson, South Carolina on March 26, 1981. His release came early, allegedly due to chronic alcoholism, but it was an honorable discharge with full benefits. Jeffrey next surfaced in Miami, Florida, where he briefly stayed before moving back home and in with his father and stepmother. In October 1981, he was arrested for disorderly conduct, possession of an open container of alcohol, and resisting arrest. He paid a $60 fine and was sent on his way. Shortly after that, he moved in with his paternal grandmother. In 1982, he was arrested for indecent exposure. He again paid a nominal fine, and in January 1985, he began working at the Ambrosia Chocolate Company. About the same time, he began regularly visiting Milwaukee's gay bars and bathhouses, experimenting on unsuspecting victims with surreptitious druggings. The Club Bath Milwaukee's was a favorite lab for his field experiments. The bathhouse owners were well aware of Jeffrey's activities, but little, if anything, was done to curtail them. In March 1987, Dahmer was again arrested for indecent exposure, after masturbating in front of 2 young boys. He paid $42 in court costs and was given a 1-year suspended sentence, from which he was released in March 1988. At that time, Dahmer was still living with his grandmother. It was in her basement that he allegedly began dismembering and dissolving bodies. His first victim was purportedly killed in a hotel and then brought back to Grandma's house in a suitcase transported by a taxi. The body of his second victim was allegedly allowed to ripen in her basement for a week. The odor, needless to say, would have been unbearable. Nevertheless, it was claimed that Grandma had no idea what Jeffrey was up to in the basement. In September 1988, Dahmer got his own apartment, which soon became one of America's most infamous death houses. That very same month, he was accused of molesting a young boy. The following May, he was convicted of second-degree sexual assault. Despite an appeal to the court by Lionel Dahmer, Jeffrey received a 3-year sentence. He served just 10 months in a minimum security facility on a work release program that allowed him to continue working at the chocolate factory. He reportedly kept a mummified head and genitals in his work locker during that time. On Thanksgiving, Dahmer was given a rare gift, 12 hours of freedom. He returned late and visibly intoxicated with no repercussions. In early 1990, Dahmer was released on parole. He remained on parole throughout his killing spree, but no one ever visited his home to check up on him. That would later become the basis of a lawsuit filed by the survivors of some of Dahmer's victims. The suit plausibly contended that a routine visit would have saved countless lives. Before Jeffrey's parole records were made public, they were, in the words of chronicler Don Davis, well vacuumed and mostly blanked out. The Wisconsin Department of Corrections ordered Dahmer's parole officer, Donna Chester, not to talk to the press. In July 1990, Dahmer hit a 15-year-old boy over the head with a rubber mallet and then attempted to strangle him. Following the attack, he then inexplicably called the kid a taxi and sent him on his way. The victim was taken to a medical center where he gave police an address and description of his assailant. No one bothered to investigate the incident. At about that same time, Jeffrey acquired a 57-gallon drum of acid, which he purportedly brought home in a taxi, and then was able to muscle up to his apartment by himself. 2 men and a moving dolly were required to remove the drum from his apartment. In May 1991, a 14-year-old boy was seen fleeing Dahmer's apartment by two young women who called the police to report the incident. The boy was naked, bleeding, and drugged into a near stupor. The responding officers chose to believe Dahmer's tale of a lover's quarrel, even though the witnesses, who were still on the scene, angrily informed them that they had seen the terror-stricken boy actively resisting Dahmer's efforts to restrain him, and despite the fact that the victim was clearly a minor. The witnesses claimed that the officers told them to go away and refused to take their names. They opted not to run a routine background check on the possible suspect, which would have revealed that Dahmer was a convicted child molester and was still on parole from previous molestation conviction. The victim of that previous molestation was the brother of the bleeding, terrified young boy in front of Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. Amazingly enough, the three officers on the scene claimed that they actually accompanied the pair back to Dahmer's apartment and noticed nothing amiss there. That was in spite of the fact that there was a 3-day-old rotting corpse lying on the bed, with the attendant smell of death permeating the apartment. There was also an abundance of morbid artifacts and photos lying about the home. Nevertheless, the officers purportedly saw nothing wrong and left the scene with the victim still in Dahmer's custody. As soon as they left, Dahmer killed the boy and then raped and disemboweled his corpse. The mother of one of the two witnesses called the police after reading a newspaper account of a missing boy who closely resembled the naked young man, but her concerns were dismissed. She then contacted the local FBI office, but she was rebuffed there as well. The woman claimed that she was instructed not to talk to the press. Dahmer's last intended victim was Tracy Edwards, a 31-year-old father of 6. Edwards had recently jumped bail in Mississippi on charges of sexually battering a 13-year-old girl. He escaped from his would-be abductor and went to the authorities with a description of the assailant and his rancid-smelling apartment. Edwards told police that he had seen Dahmer undergo a sudden radical transformation. His face was completely changed. I wouldn't have recognized him. It was as if the devil himself stood in front of me. The apartment, he said, was filled with photos of male torsos. It was filled with considerably more than that. There were bloodstains on the bed. There was an extensive collection of photos depicting bodies in various stages of dismemberment. 4 intact heads were found, 1 in the refrigerator and 3 in the freezer. Another freezer was filled with wrapped, unmarked meat and a human heart. A file drawer was filled with bones. The barrel of acid was brimming with miscellaneous body parts. 1 kettle was filled with skulls and another contained severed hands and penises. 7 skulls in all were found. Gruesome photo albums were scattered about the house. Dahmer was initially charged with 4 counts of murder and his bail was set at $1 million. Prosecutors soon added 8 additional murder counts and raised the bail amount to $5 million. Another 3 counts were then added, although there was no body parts or photos to support the additional charges. Prosecutors claimed that 1 photo album had been destroyed. They also claimed that the bodies of the victims depicted in that particular album had been conveniently enough tossed out with the trash. Jeffrey's trial began in January 1992. His attorney, Gerald Boyle, who had previously set his sights on becoming the city's district attorney, had waived his client's right to a preliminary trial. Boyle had also allowed his client to give detailed confessions to his crimes during lengthy interrogations. Dahmer entered a plea of guilty but insane. He was given a 937-year prison sentence. By the end of the year, his apartment building had been destroyed. 3 police officers who had unknowingly or otherwise aided and abetted the serial killer were cleared of any wrongdoing. There were inevitably questions that were left unanswered by the trial. 2 of the victims had been abducted from Chicago, and Dahmer did not own or have use of a car. How were those victims transported? The remains of some victims were never found. Were their bodies really disposed of, all in the trash? And if so, why did Dahmer choose to dispose of only a select few bodies? Some aspects of Jeffrey's confessions were completely unsupported by the evidence. To what extent did Dahmer's interrogators shape those confessions? One victim's grandmother reportedly receiving several phone calls during which she heard groaning, choking, and faint cries of "help me, help me, help me." Those calls came a few weeks after the disappearance of her grandson. Was he kept alive for an extended period of time? Dahmer, like all collectors, was obsessed with gaining control over his victims. He preferred means of doing so and of disposing of the bodies that accumulated from his failed experiments was through the use of chemicals, an interest that was acquired perhaps from his research chemist father. Jeffrey was reportedly working on perfecting a home lobotomy procedure that involved drilling a hole in the victim's forehead and then injecting various combinations of chemicals. Jeffrey has been described as a dabbler in Satanism, but it is likely that he was more than just a dabbler. In his apartment, he had a detailed plan for constructing a satanic altar. The plan incorporated the human skulls and other artifacts that he had been collecting. He told authorities that he believed that by constructing the altar and by consuming the flesh of his victims, he would be infused with special powers and energies that would help him to succeed socially and financially. Oddly enough, in March 1999, the brother of one of Dahmer's victims was found stabbed to death. Police described the young man's death as a ritual sacrifice. Dahmer served just 2 years of his prison sentence before he was inexplicably paired with 2 homicidal inmates on an unsupervised work detail. Only one of the 3 made it through the day. Needless to say, it was not Jeffrey Dahmer. It seems quite obvious when you go through these cases that there are many more people involved. It's rooted in Satanism, and it's all being covered up with the serial killer narrative. Alright, let's examine the case of Herb Baumeister. As a child, Herb Baumeister reportedly never showed any emotion, even when his father became physical, which apparently happened quite frequently. Herb Baumeister Sr. had served in World War II, after which he graduated from Indiana University's School of Medicine and began work as an anesthesiologist. His son and namesake initially set out to follow his father's academic footsteps by enrolling in college as an anatomy major. Unlike his father, however, Herb Jr. dropped out of school. He then married Juliana Sater, the daughter of a superintendent at the Naval Air Warfare Center. Herb and Juliana were both members of the Young Republicans, as was Ted Bundy. Not long after the marriage, Herb's father had his newlywed son committed to Loru D. Carter Memorial Hospital, a state-run mental hospital. The Carter facility catered to patients with serious mental impairments, yet there is no indication that Herb was, at that time, seriously impaired. And if he had been, his father was an extremely wealthy man who could have easily afforded to get his son private care. Herb Sr.'s choice of facilities, therefore, was a rather odd one. Long before the confinement at Carter, Herb Sr. had reportedly secreted his young son off to be administered mental examinations. Herb was released from the Carter facility after 2 months. His diagnosis noted that he exhibited 2 or more distinct personalities. Following his confinement, Baumeister took a job at the Indianapolis Star. The position that he took at the newspaper was known to be regularly filled by the sons and daughters of the wealthy and powerful. Herb's next job, driving a hearse, provided him with his requisite blooding. Herb Sr. then once again pulled some strings to land Herb Jr. a position with the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, where one of his duties was serving as the Bureau's liaison to the Indiana State Police. Herb left the Bureau in 1985 and thereafter remained unemployed while wife Juliana occupied her time doing volunteer work. In 1986, warrants were issued for Herb's arrest on charges of theft and conspiracy to commit theft. True to form, Baumeister opted to waive his right to a jury trial and place his fate in the hands of a judge. The bench trial, such as it was over in just a day. Herb was found not guilty on all counts. By that time, the Baumeisters had been living quite well for an extended period of time, even though neither of them was gainfully employed. Herb then decided that the time was right to start up his own business. With a $350,000 loan from his mother, he opened a thrift store in 1988 in conjunction with the Children's Bureau of Indianapolis. He founded Thrift Management Incorporated. Herb's close association with the Children's Bureau, which primarily catered to orphans, the type of victims who aren't likely to be missed, hints at the possibility that his thrift store business was a cover for more profitable and nefarious business pursuits. By 1990, Herb's company was growing rapidly, and he opened up a second store. To staff his stores, Herb assembled a workforce of attractive young male employees, just like John Wayne Gacy had done. But all outward appearances, things were going quite well for the Ballmeisters. In November 91, Herb, Juliana, and their 3 kids moved into a new home, a 4-bedroom, 5-bathroom estate with an indoor pool situated on 18.5 acres, known as the Fox Hollow Farm. The property also featured a barn and horse stables. The family maintained a second home as well, and also had access to a condominium on Lake Wawasee owned by Herb's mother. 3 years after moving to Fox Hollow Farm, 13-year-old Eric Baumeister discovered a skeleton in the backyard. He dutifully reported his find to his mother, but Julie told no one, including the police, of her son's discovery. By that time, young gay men and male prostitutes in the Indianapolis area had been disappearing for a long time. From about 1980 on, their bodies began surfacing in Indiana and western Ohio. Many were strangled and deposited along Ohio's Interstate 70. One victim had his arms, legs, and head severed and his torso completely drained of blood. The severed parts were never recovered. 4 bodies were found clustered together on October 14, 1983, in what was described as a private graveyard. A nearby barn was found to contain both a pentagram and an inverted cross. In the mid-1980s, a man from Terre Haute, Indiana named Larry Eiler confessed to kidnapping, torturing, and murdering as many as 23 of the victims. The second victim that he took credit for killing disappeared on the eve of Halloween 1982. The 6th went missing on the spring equinox of 1983. Eiler claimed that for 6 of the torture murders he worked with accomplices. Among the accomplices he fingered was Robert David Little, a professor at Indiana State University and the former head of the Terre Haute chapter of the ACLU. Little and Eiler had lived together since 1975. In May 1983, a task force was formed. The following month, dozens of law enforcement officials gathered for a summit to review the case. The task force made little progress, however, until an anonymous tipster turned in Eiler. From that point on, Eiler was reportedly under constant surveillance, but the disappearances and killings continued. Eiler had previously been arrested in August 1978 after attacking and stabbing a hitchhiker who he had left for dead. When taken into custody, Eiler was in possession of a sword, 3 knives, and a canister of tear gas. He was charged with attempted murder, and his bond was initially set at $50,000. After 1 day, his bail was lowered to $10,000, allowing his friends to free him. Eiler's attorney paid off the victim with a check for $2,500, and all charges were dropped. On November 13th, the presiding judge dismissed the case and ordered Eiler to pay just $43 in court costs. 3 years later, in 1981, Eiler was again arrested for drugging a 14-year-old boy and then dumping his unconscious body. It is unclear how that case was disposed of. When Eiler was arrested on suspicion of involvement in the I-70 murders, officers reportedly found a bloodstained knife in his truck. The boots that he was wearing, which were also bloodstained, matched plaster casts of boot prints taken from one of the crime scenes. The tires on his truck also matched plaster casts of tracks present at one of the murder scenes. As legal counsel, Eiler retained David Shippers, who later achieved notoriety as the Democratic attorney who presented the Republican-controlled House Judiciary Committee's legally spacious case for the impeachment of President Clinton, and who later still achieved yet more notoriety by raising his voice to question limited aspects of the official September 11th story. In the Eiler case, Shippers promptly filed a motion to suppress all evidence seized in the case. His motion was granted and the state's case against his client essentially evaporated. Eiler was freed and he immediately packed up and moved to John Gacy's Chicago. where he was later seen dumping trash bags filled with body parts into the trash bin of an apartment building. He was described as having a glassy look in his eyes as he went about his task. In addition to his fingerprints on the trash bags, investigators who searched his apartment found bloodstains, a hacksaw, more trash bags, and a t-shirt belonging to the dismembered victim. Shippers opted not to represent Eiler again, but he did serve as an advisor on the defense team. Eiler was convicted and, on October 3, 1986, sentenced to death. 4 years later, he fingered Professor Robert David Little as the mastermind behind the killings. He also claimed that the professor had photographed the sadistic murders in progress. Eiler was administered a polygraph examination, which he reportedly passed. Search warrants were served at the home that Little had shared with Eiler, as well as at Little's university office. A number of videotapes and photographs were seized. Seized phone records revealed that Eiler had established a pattern of making late-night telephone calls to the house from various locations, though it is unclear if those locations corresponded to the locations of the disappearances. Little was indicted, brought to trial, and then acquitted on April 17, 1991. Eiler, though, continued to supply information to investigators who were attempting to build a case against Little and other accomplices. Those efforts came to an abrupt end in March 1994 when Eiler died, reportedly from AIDS. Many of his victims disappeared from the very same 2-square-mile section of Indianapolis, peppered with gay bars that served as Herb's hunting grounds. Like Eiler, who was supplied by a doctor with Placidil to drug his victims, Herb had ready access to drugs thanks to his father's prescription pads. Herb had also been to Ohio dozens of times in the late 80s and early 90s. Police first approached Herb and Julie to question them about the disappearances in November 1995. Herb immediately retained an attorney, James Voiles, the lawyer who had a few years before had won an acquittal for Robert David Little. In May 1996, the Children's Bureau terminated its contract with Herb and began publicly distancing itself from his operation, purportedly because the Save-A-Lot stores were in financial trouble. On June 20th, Herb informed his wife that he was taking the kids for physical examinations and then enrolling them in a summer program at the Culver Military Academy, where aspiring serial killer Doug Clark once resided. Julie had other plans, however, and on June 23rd she consented to a police search of the property. When the search began the next day, Herb was away at the lake house with his son Eric. Investigators almost immediately discovered human bones and bone fragments on the property. They were not hard to find since they were scattered about in plain sight, and there were literally thousands of them. Even though indications were that this was a multiple homicide case, it was assigned to Detective Sergeant Kenneth Wiseman, who had never handled a homicide case. Police promptly and rather ridiculously claimed that they were days, if not weeks, away from being ready to question Herb Baumeister. The majority of the bones found at the Fox Hollow Farm had been burned, crushed, and scattered, making identification nearly impossible. It was not possible to even estimate the number of victims, though it was determined that there were no less than 11. More than 6,000 bones and bone fragments were recovered. Strangely, though, no skulls were ever found. Although the site where the bodies had been burned, readily identifiable by the scorched ground, was in clear view of the home's kitchen window. Julie Baumeister swore that she knew nothing about the murders. Neighbors, however, questioned how the avid gardener, who spent a good deal of time in her yard, could have been unaware of the thousands of bones, many of them visible to the naked eye. Julie Baumeister told police investigators that her husband was an avid videographer who maintained a private collection of hundreds of tapes. When she led them to the storage closet where the tapes were normally kept, however, all of them had suddenly gone missing. Investigators noticed that a vent in the wall appeared to have been used to hide a video camera for surreptitious filming. A witness who had been taken to Fox Hollow Farm by Herb, whose tips had led to the initial questioning of the Baumeisters, reported seeing a closet filled with professional video equipment, including cameras, lenses, tripods, and lighting equipment. No such equipment was found during the search. Police seized only 10 items from the house. 5 of those items were videotapes. 2 days after the search of the property began, Julie Baumeister obtained an emergency order for temporary custody of her son Eric. Officers were dispatched to the lake house where Herb was staying, and the child was brought back despite the fact that authorities had already spent 2 full days excavating Baumeister's 18-acre graveyard. He was not questioned about the discoveries on his property. As soon as the officers left with Eric, Herb promptly disappeared, which did not seem to concern police investigators. Over the next few days, searchers discovered a drainage ditch on the property that contained an abundance of large bones but still no skulls. Wistman still insisted that there was not enough evidence to issue a warrant for Baumeister's arrest. On July 2nd, a Canadian police officer found Herb sleeping in his car near Ontario Park. The officer observed a number of items in the car, including an overnight bag, envelopes, newspapers, piles of other unidentified papers, and what appears to be videotapes. The next day, police again found Herb. This time, he was in the park by the water's edge with a .357 Magnum bullet hole in his head. His car had been emptied of all personal items. A search of the area yielded no evidence that Herb had disposed of any of the items that had been in his possession just the night before. None of his possessions were ever recovered or accounted for. What was said to be a suicide note was found. It was addressed rather bizarrely, "Attention Canadian authorities." Around that same time, Baumeister's older brother, Brad, was found floating in a hot tub in Texas. Brad's death remains an unsolved mystery. Perhaps the Baumeister family just had a run of bad luck. The day after Herb Baumeister's body was discovered in a park, it was autopsied by Canadian authorities, who promptly announced that the autopsy report would not be ready for release for about a year. Since some of the I-70 murders remained unsolved, Indianapolis officials were under intense pressure to investigate any possible connection to the Baumeister case. Police had 2 key pieces of physical evidence that had been gathered from the scenes of the unsolved killing: a semen sample and palm print. The semen sample, however, just sort of disappeared, with only the palm print remaining. A technician was duly dispatched to obtain a print of Herb's corpse, still in custody of Canadian officials. What followed purportedly was a ridiculous series of errors. The technician purportedly returned from Canada with a print that was unusable. The official story holds that the print simply didn't take, but it was never explained why the technician got all the way back to the States before realizing that. He was sent back to try again, and once again returned with a print that did not take. Not to be deterred, the technician was sent back a 3rd time, only to find that the corpse had been cremated, destroying the last chance that authorities had to definitively tie Herb to the I-70 murders with hard physical evidence. Why officials would have repeatedly sent the same obviously incompetent technician has never been explained. Through witness statements and circumstantial evidence, however, Baumeister was ultimately tied to at least one of the I-70 victims. No one, needless to say, ever stood trial for the unsolved I-70 killings. For the mass murder that occurred at Fox Hollow Farm, Herb was posthumously declared solely responsible for the deaths of the 4 victims whose remains could be identified. All were local gay men who had been reported missing. They were just 4 of at least 10 local men who had been reported missing after frequenting area gay bars over the previous 3 years. The police and local press had consistently ignored and/or downplayed the disappearances. The Herb Baumeister story would not be complete without the mention of a colorful character named Virgil Vandegrift, who played a prominent role in the Baumeister investigation. Vandegrift was a former sheriff turned private investigator. In the mid-1970s, he had been sent out to the LAP Academy for hypnosis training. His father reportedly dabbled in hypnosis as well. In 1977, not long after receiving that special training, Vandegrift worked on the case of Brett Kimberlin, the so-called Speedway bomber. The very same Brett Kimberlin resurfaced in 1988, claiming that he had been vice presidential nominee Dan Quayle's college drug supplier. Kimberlin was promptly put into solitary confinement and cut off from press access. Van de Graaff was hired by the families of two of the missing victims, both of whom felt that the police were doing next to nothing to find their sons. In August 1994, the aforementioned witness, who survived a visit to Herb's house, first talked to Van de Graaff. He described Fox Hollow Farm and the strange man who had taken him there. One of Van de Graaff's associates reportedly located Fox Hollow based on the man's description. For unexplained reasons, the associate obtained aerial photographs of the property that he presented to the witness for identification. The witness, who of course had never seen the ranch from the air, was unable to ID the property from the photographs. As a result, there was a considerable delay in identifying Herb Baumeister as the prime suspect. Why Van de Graaff's investigator did not present the witness with surveillance photos of the property from the perspective that he had actually viewed it is another of the lingering mysteries surrounding the Baumeister case. In November 1997, Van de Graaff's secretary, Connie Pierce, who had worked closely with the witness in the Baumeister case, died suddenly at the age of 46. In the spring of that same year, bones were still being uncovered at Fox Hollow Farm. I would really encourage anybody who's interested in knowing more about what goes on in society, or behind the scenes of what we're supposed to believe in the mainstream as these strange cases, and whenever you hear about Satanism, and especially things like Pizzagate and all these crazy conspiracy theories that we're told are so crazy, but when you read books like this, it's really, it doesn't seem so crazy anymore, especially when you read about just the ridiculous reality of these mainstream stories and narratives that we're supposed to believe without looking into these details, which totally debunk what we're told is the truth. If you found any of this interesting, I would highly recommend that you read this book by David McGowan. It's called Program to Kill. It goes into a lot more detail. I just shared a couple of the stories that he wrote about in here, but it's not even, it barely scratches the surface, some of the stuff that I'm talking about here. He goes very deep into Project MK Ultra, the Phoenix program, the CIA running these programs at the same time or very shortly after these serial killings start happening as a result of enacting these programs. So it's really interesting to start finding the connection between serial killers and what's really going on, and the fact that it seems like, just going with the evidence presented here, it really does seem like that these serial killings are the result of satanic cults that involve lots of people and lots of very powerful people, and it's a lot more prominent than what we're led to believe. We are led to believe that these are very rare occurrences, that all of these serial killings are just random happenstances from crazy people who are just they were abused, they were kind of born into a situation that caused them to become a serial killer. And even though this this does happen with people who, later in life they become violent, it's the narrative of the serial killer as we've been led to believe is really not true if you take into account all the evidence in this book. It seems to be true that these serial killers were recruited by satanic cults, and all of these murders are ritual sacrifices. If you know anything about Satanism and what they really do with getting into the Illuminati secret societies and the fact, just ask yourself why secret societies exist. What are they doing in secret that they don't want you to know about? Why are secret societies full of such powerful people, like politicians, like police officers, police commissioners, the people in society that are able to cover these things up, make it look like it's something that it's not? So I would really encourage you, if you really want to open up your mind to some interesting possibilities and look for some deeper truths, Program to Kill, check it out.
Just let me out.